What would you do if the man who pulled you from a burning plane wreck, the man who ran back into the fire when everyone else was running away, was about to lose the only thing he had left in this world? She had billions in the bank. He had 11 days before the bank took his daughters home. She owned companies on 3 continents. He owned a toolbox and a mortgage that was killing him slowly, and neither of them knew that the crash that nearly ended her life was about to change both of their lives, in ways neither could have imagined. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning Brandon Hale almost died started like every other morning he'd had for the past 3 years. Badly. He burned the eggs. Not a little. Fully, catastrophically burned them. Black smoke curling up from the pan, the smoke alarm screaming off the kitchen ceiling, and his 6-year-old daughter Lily standing in the doorway in her pink pajamas with the worn rabbit stitched on the chest, staring at him with an expression that was somewhere between pity and disappointment. "Daddy," she said, with the specific gravity that only small children can project. "That's the 3rd time this week." "It's Tuesday," he said. "I know." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Brandon turned off the burner, fanned a dish towel at the smoke alarm until it quit screaming, and then stood there for a moment with one hand gripping the edge of the counter, looking at the ruined pan. The eggs had gone from yellow to brown to black in the time it took him to check his phone, which he shouldn't have done, but he did, because there'd been another email from Keystone Regional Bank. 3rd one that week. Also Tuesday. He turned the phone face down without reading it. "Cereal?" he said. Lily nodded. Pragmatic kid. She got that from her mother. He got the box from the cabinet, the one with the cartoon tiger on it that Lily had picked out herself last grocery run, clutching it to her chest in the cereal aisle like it was something precious. And he poured it into her bowl and added milk and set it in front of her at the kitchen table. And he stood there watching her eat for a moment before he went back to scraping burned egg out of the pan. Outside the kitchen window, April was being unpredictable, the way April in Pennsylvania always was. Cold sky the color of old nickels. Frost still crusting the dead grass at the edges of the yard. The dogwood his wife, Clara, had planted the spring before she got sick stood bare and skeletal at the corner of the property, waiting for warmth that wasn't there yet. Brandon scraped the pan. Didn't think about the email. He got Lily to school 20 minutes late, which she informed him counted as very late, not a little late, and which would be noted in her Friday folder. He said he understood. She kissed him on the cheek anyway, quick, distracted, already moving toward her classroom with her SpongeBob backpack bouncing. And he stood in the school parking lot for a moment after she disappeared through the door, doing nothing, just standing. The cold got into his collar and he didn't fix it. Then he got in the truck and drove to work. Millhaven Regional Airport wasn't the kind of airport that ended up in travel magazines. It served 2 commercial carriers, a small charter operation, and a rotating fleet of cargo planes that brought in industrial parts for the manufacturing plants north of town. The terminal had been renovated in the late 90s and hadn't been touched since, which you could tell by the carpet pattern and the specific shade of teal used on the walls. It processed maybe 800 passengers on a busy day. Brandon had worked here for 2 years, 8 months. Maintenance technician. He inspected aircraft, filed reports, replaced parts, and did it all without calling attention to himself, which suited him fine. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald Fitch, who wore the same coffee-stained fleece vest every single day, had told him during his annual review that Brandon was the best worker he'd probably never hear about, which Brandon took as the compliment it was intended to be. He clocked in at 7:43, grabbed his kit from the locker room, and went to work on Gate 4, where a regional jet needed its auxiliary power unit inspected before the 8:15 departure. That was the flight. He didn't know that yet. He was just doing his job, crouched under the fuselage with a flashlight, running his fingers along a hydraulic coupling that had been logged as slightly irregular in the overnight check, when the 8:15 started boarding. It was a CRJ 700. 42-seat regional jet operated by Northbridge Air, a carrier Brandon knew from his previous life with the particular intimacy of someone who'd spent years studying such aircraft and had very specific opinions about how they were maintained. He kept those opinions to himself these days, Nobody at Millhaven wanted to hear what Brandon Hale used to know. They just wanted him to change the parts and sign the form. He finished the APU inspection, logged it, stood up, and started toward the maintenance shed. That was when he heard the sound. It wasn't loud. That was the thing people got wrong about catastrophic failures, that they imagined big explosions, Hollywood stuff, a wall of fire and a shockwave. Sometimes it was like that. But sometimes it was just a wrong sound, a mechanical complaint, a brief, ugly scraping followed by silence that lasted about a second too long. Brandon stopped walking. He turned and looked at the runway. The CRJ 700 was in its takeoff roll, maybe 800 feet down the strip, moving fast. And something was wrong with the way it was moving. Something about the yaw. The way it was tracking slightly left when it should have been holding center line. Minor, small. The kind of thing that could mean nothing, or the kind of thing that meant everything. He heard it again. That sound. Like something under serious stress suddenly deciding it had had enough. The plane lifted off, barely, maybe 30 feet of altitude. And then the left engine did something that engines are specifically designed never to do, and the aircraft rotated hard to the left, and Brandon was already moving before he fully processed what he was seeing. The CRJ came down a quarter-mile past the runway threshold in the rough scrubland that buffered the airport from the state road. It didn't so much crash as collapse, the fuselage buckling as it hit the uneven ground, the left wing shearing off on impact and immediately lighting up as the fuel cells ruptured. The sound, the real sound, came then. A concussive boom that hit Brandon in the chest like a fist. He was running. He had no plan. He had no authorization. He had a pair of work gloves shoved in his back pocket and steel-toed boots and whatever was still working in his body after 2.5 years of grief and bad sleep and terrible eggs. He vaulted the perimeter fence, tore his jacket on the barbed wire, barely noticed, and ran through the scrub grass toward the smoke. Behind him, he could hear Gerald Fitch screaming his name. He didn't stop. The plane was in 3 visible sections. The tail section had broken cleanest, sheared off maybe 20 feet back from the main cabin. The forward fuselage and cockpit were the worst, buckled, one side crushed against a concrete drainage culvert that had redirected the impact in the worst possible direction. The left wing was on fire. The right wing was still structurally attached, but leaking fuel in a thin, terrible stream. Brandon took all of this in during the 5 seconds it took him to reach the aircraft. There were people moving. He could see them. Passengers extricating themselves from the aft section, some limping, some crawling, 2 who appeared largely unharmed helping others out through a gap where the fuselage had separated. He registered them, but didn't stop moving. Those people were getting out. He went for the forward section. The entry door on the right side was jammed but not sealed. He got his fingers into the gap between the door and the frame. It had deformed slightly in the impact, creating a 1/2 inch of space, and he pulled, using his legs and his back and everything he had. The door groaned, resisted. He repositioned, braced his boot against the fuselage, and pulled again, and this time it gave with a sound like a bad tooth coming out. The smoke inside was immediate and thick. He dropped low, always go low, and pulled the collar of his jacket up over his nose and went in. First row, empty. The 2 seats on the left side were crumpled, but the occupants were gone, either evacuated or thrown clear. Second row, a man in his 50s, semi-conscious, belt still buckled. Brandon got the belt, got the man's arm over his shoulder, got him moving toward the door and handed him to the person he could see through the smoke, someone from the back who had climbed forward to help. Third row, a woman, mid-30s, dark hair. She'd hit the seat back in front of her during impact. He could see the blood at her hairline and the way she was slumped. Not the slump of someone sleeping, but the slump of someone completely absent, belt still on, window side. The seat next to her had collapsed partially inward, pinning her right arm against the armrest. Brandon looked at the arm, looked at the collapsed seat, looked at the fire visible through the porthole window that was eating its way from the left wing toward the fuselage. He had maybe 3 minutes. Maybe. He got his weight between the collapsed seat and the intact one, leveraging his hip against the damaged seat frame and pushed. The seat resisted in the way that aircraft components always resisted. They were built to hold tremendous force. And he pushed harder, feeling something in his lower back complain loudly. The seat shifted. Not a lot. An inch, maybe two. Enough. He got the woman's arm free, got his hands under her arms and lifted, and she was dead weight, all of it, no muscle response, and he staggered backward with her, deeper into the smoke, before he got his bearings and turned and moved toward the door. The heat was something different by the time he got her to the exit. Not just ambient warmth, active, directional, the particular savage heat of a fuel fire finding its way toward oxygen. His eyes were streaming. His lungs were telling him extremely specific things about what they thought of this plan. He got her through the door, got them both onto the ground outside, dragged her. He wasn't going to win any medical care awards for technique, but getting her away from the aircraft was the only thing that mattered right now. Dragged her 50 feet through the scrub grass before his legs decided they were done, and he went to one knee. He checked her breathing. There was breath. There was a pulse at her throat, rapid but present. He looked at her face. She had a good face. Not that it mattered, not that he was registering it particularly, but later, when he tried to reconstruct the moment, that was what he remembered. A good face. Someone in there, even with the blood and the pallor and the stillness. He stood up. He went back to the aircraft. He made 2 more trips. The details are messy, the way real things are always messy. A teenage boy with a broken arm who kept saying, "I don't want to die," over and over, a kind of prayer without a destination. And Brandon saying, "You're not going to die. Come on, let's go. You're not going to die." And meaning it, because the boy was walking, because his legs were working, and sometimes that's all the medicine there is. An older woman who was conscious and capable and simply frozen, locked into her seat by some mechanism Brandon recognized from his own grief, the inability to move through the door of the thing that was trying to kill you. And he said something to her, something quiet that he couldn't even recall afterward, and she moved. The left-wing fire reached the fuselage about 40 seconds after he got the last person clear. The detonation was modest by the standards of such things, but it was enough to put him on the ground, face first in the scrub grass, ears ringing, the heat rolling over him in a wave. He lay there for a moment, just a moment, smelling Pennsylvania dirt and dead grass in his own singed jacket. Then he heard the emergency vehicles. Lots of them. Probably been arriving for the last 5 minutes while he was busy not noticing. He got up. His hands were shaking. He put them in his pocket so they could shake privately. He walked toward the perimeter fence, back the way he'd come, and met Gerald Fitch on the other side. Gerald stared at him. Gerald was not usually a man who lacked for words. "You're bleeding," Gerald finally said. Brandon looked down, his left forearm exposed where the jacket sleeve had torn at the barbed wire. A decent cut. He hadn't noticed. "Yeah," he said. Brandon, you ran into that." "I need to file my incident report," Brandon said. "Before I forget the details." Gerald kept staring at him. "Gerald, the report." "Yeah," Gerald said. "Yeah, okay. Come on. The paramedics got him in their 3rd pass of the staging area. He would have avoided them entirely, except one of them was persistent, and the cut on his forearm actually needed stitches, which he hadn't noticed because the adrenaline was still doing most of his feeling for him. He sat on the tailgate of an ambulance and let a young EMT named Darnell do the work while the full circus of disaster response played out around them. Fire trucks, police, airport authority vehicles, a local news van already setting up on the road. "You pulled people out of that?" Darnell asked. He was trying to be professional about it, but his hands kept slowing down. "Few people," Brandon said. "How many?" Brandon thought about it. 5. Plus I helped one of the guys from the back with another. 6 people. I didn't count. Darnell looked at him for a long moment. "Man," he said softly. Then he went back to the stitches. An airport authority officer came over after Darnell finished. Young guy, nervous, holding a tablet like it might protect him. He asked Brandon a series of questions in a specific bureaucratic order that Brandon had to answer carefully because some of his answers, the ones about what he'd heard, the mechanical sounds, the yaw on takeoff roll, were going to generate paperwork that he suspected was going to complicate people's days considerably. He told the truth. He always told the truth. It was a character flaw that had cost him significantly. The officer wrote everything down with the careful handwriting of someone who knew this document was going to be read by people above his pay grade. A detective came over, then someone from the FAA field office who materialized with impressive speed and had the specific eyes of a person who had seen crash sites before. Brandon answered questions. He signed things. He described what he'd seen on the runway in terms that were more technical than anyone expected from a maintenance technician. And the FAA guy's eyes sharpened at that, but he didn't say anything. Through all of it, nobody said thank you. Nobody said good job. An airport authority administrator who arrived around 11 told him that his unauthorized entry onto an active emergency site was going to require a formal review. Brandon said he understood. The administrator seemed vaguely dissatisfied by his equanimity. He was cleared at 12:30, told not to leave town, standard crash investigation language, told there would be follow-up. He drove to Lily's school. He was only an hour late for pickup. She sat in the back seat and told him about her day with the systematic thoroughness of a prosecutor presenting evidence, and he listened to every word. And somewhere between the story about Jalen stealing her eraser and the thing that happened at recess that was either very funny or very unfair, depending on your perspective, the shaking in his hands finally stopped. He made dinner that night. Not eggs. Pasta. He only burned it a little. The news that evening led with the crash. Miracle at Millhaven. That's what the anchor called it. 41 of 42 passengers survived, along with both crew members. Remarkable outcome given the severity of the incident. The one fatality was in the cockpit, the first officer, whose position in the aircraft at the moment of impact had been unsurvivable. Brandon heard that and sat with it in the way you sat with things you couldn't change. The news report mentioned several acts of bravery by bystanders and first responders. That was the whole of it. He turned off the television before Lily could watch it. She was 6. She didn't need this. And got her into the bath and through the whole bedtime ritual that Clara had established, and that he maintained with religious precision because it was the one thing he could give Lily that was still entirely hers. The stories. The specific way you tucked the blanket. The glass of water on the nightstand that she never drank but always needed to have there. He sat on the edge of her bed after she fell asleep. The room was dark except for the nightlight. The small one shaped like a crescent moon that had been in this room since before Lily could remember having it. He sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just being in the room with his daughter, listening to her breathe. Then he went downstairs and picked up his phone. The email from Keystone Regional Bank. He read it this time. Dear Mr. Hale, this is a formal notice regarding your outstanding mortgage obligation on the property located at 412 Tanner Creek Road, Millhaven, Pennsylvania. Your account is currently 94 days past due, constituting a default under the terms of your mortgage agreement. If full payment of the arrears, $18,740, is not received within 11 days, foreclosure proceedings will be initiated in accordance with... He set the phone down, looked at the ceiling of the kitchen. The plaster had a crack in it he'd been meaning to fix since November. Clara would have had it fixed in a week. She was the one who got things done. He was the one who noticed them and then thought about them extensively. $18,740. He had 11 days, Bass. He had $1,100 in checking. He had about $3,000 in savings, which was also supposed to be Lily's emergency fund and her school fund, and approximately 17 other funds that had collapsed into one uncertain pile. He'd been sending partial payments for 4 months, ever since he'd taken the maintenance job after the thing with Meridian Aerospace, after the thing he didn't let himself think about too often, because thinking about it made the anger come back, and the anger wasn't useful. He'd been keeping the lights on and the food in the pantry, and Lily in her school with the rabbit on her pajamas, and the specific cereal she loved, and he had been handling it. Except he hadn't been handling it. He'd been holding the dam with his hands while the water rose. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. He didn't make any calls. There was nobody to call. His parents were gone, Claire's parents were in Florida and had their own problems, and his friends from his previous life, the aerospace world, the before life, he'd let those connections atrophy the way you let things atrophy when you're too deep in grief to remember what maintenance looks like. Finally, he went to bed. He lay in the dark on his side of the bed, the side he always slept on, and looked at the dark ceiling, and thought about his daughter sleeping down the hall, and thought about the crack in the kitchen plaster, and thought about the woman with the good face he'd pulled out of that burning aircraft. He hoped she made it. He genuinely didn't know. After he'd gotten her clear, the EMTs had swept in and she'd disappeared into the machinery of emergency medicine, and he'd never found out what happened to her. He didn't even know her name. He closed his eyes. He slept badly, which was normal. Dreamed about Clara, which was also normal. Woke up at 4:30 with his heart pounding over something he couldn't remember, which was the most normal thing of all. In the morning, he burned the eggs again. The days after the crash were complicated in the specific way that disasters aftermaths are always complicated. Lots of noise, lots of process, very little resolution. Brandon was interviewed twice more by FAA investigators, once in person at a field office in Harrisburg and once by phone with someone from the NTSB preliminary team. He answered their questions carefully and completely because he understood what they were doing, and he understood that what he had to say was relevant to it in ways that were going to make some people very uncomfortable. The questions about what he'd seen, the mechanical sounds, the behavior on the takeoff roll, were ones he'd answered before, years ago, in a different context, to different people, and with very similar results. Careful note-taking, polite dismissal. Nobody quite saying we don't believe you, but communicating it clearly through the architecture of their follow-up questions. He told the NTSB investigator, "I've actually filed reports that speak to these kinds of failure modes from 2019 when I was with Meridian Aerospace." There was a pause on the phone. "Can you spell Meridian?" the investigator asked. He spelled it. He gave the name of the division. He gave his own name as it appeared in the documentation. He was very precise, because precision was the only weapon he had, and he'd learned a long time ago to use it carefully. The investigator said they would look into it. That was what they always said. Life didn't pause for investigations. The bank's 11-day window was ticking. Brandon called a housing counselor the day after the crash. A woman named Patricia at a nonprofit in Harrisburg who worked with families facing foreclosure, whose number he'd gotten from a county resource sheet months ago, and only now gotten around to calling. She was calm and organized and very clear with him. His options were limited. A loan modification might be possible, but required bank cooperation, which Keystone Regional had historically not been enthusiastic about. A short sale would save the credit score but lose the house. The only route to keeping the property was satisfying the arrears, which required money he didn't have. "What about the missed payments as a single parent?" he asked. "Clara died 2.5 years ago. I was working in a much higher salary position. There was—" "I understand the circumstances," Patricia said, and she did sound like she understood genuinely. "The bank is not currently required to factor those circumstances into foreclosure proceedings unless you're in a federally protected category, which—" "I know," he said. He thanked her. He got off the phone. He sat in the parking lot of the airport during his lunch break and looked at the runway, at the scorched earth at the threshold where the CRJ 700 had first contacted the ground, and he thought about the mechanisms by which things fail. He thought about Clara, the quickness of it. Diagnosis to funeral in 6 weeks, which was enough time to understand what was happening, but not enough time to do anything about how badly you didn't want it to happen. He'd taken the bereavement leave and then the FMLA, and then left Meridian because Lily was 4 years old and terrified and needed a parent who was physically present, and the aerospace career and the salary that had gone with it had simply stopped. He didn't regret it. Not Lily. Never Lily. But the consequences had compounded, the way consequences do. Gerald Fitch stopped by his workstation on day 4 after the crash, stood there fussing with the zipper on his vest, which told Brandon something important was coming. "People have been asking about you," Gerald said. "What kind of people?" "Media, couple of them. They got your name from somewhere. FAA, maybe, or one of the other passengers gave a statement." Gerald looked at him carefully. "You want to talk to them?" "No." "You sure? Bit of good press, maybe some attention on—" "Gerald." He set down the inspection form he was working on. "I don't need attention. I need my check on Friday and to keep doing my job. Is there an issue with that?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "No issue," he said. "Just seems like you could, I don't know, use something going your way." "I'm fine," Brandon said. Gerald nodded slowly. He didn't believe it, Brandon could tell, but he was a decent man who understood when not to push. "Okay," Gerald said. "You're fine." He walked away, and Brandon picked up the inspection form, and the day went on the way days go on. On day 7, he got a certified letter. Not from the bank this time. From an attorney's office in Philadelphia. Carver, Ashford, and Wells, LLP. He'd never heard of them. He opened it in the truck before his shift, engine running for the heat. The letter was brief. It said that a client of the firm wished to contact him regarding a matter of personal gratitude, and that this client had reason to believe he had rendered significant assistance to her on the morning of April 14th. If he was willing to speak, he could contact a Miss Elena Park at the number listed below. He read it twice. He put it in the glove compartment with the bank notices. He went to work. 3 days later, he called the number. Not because he particularly wanted to. He had a specific distrust of things that presented themselves as simple gratitude. But because the return address on the letter was from a law firm he'd looked up on his phone, and Carver, Ashford, and Wells was not a company that wrote personal gratitude letters on behalf of clients who weren't worth taking seriously, and because something in the phrase significant assistance caught at him in a way he couldn't quite put down. The woman who answered, Ms. Elena Park, he assumed, had the voice of someone who was professionally composed and privately very busy. "Mr. Hale," she said, "thank you for calling." "Who's your client?" he said. A brief pause. "I'd prefer to let her explain. Are you available this week for a call? Or if you prefer, an in-person meeting could be arranged in—" "I'd prefer a name," he said, "before I agree to anything." Another pause. Longer this time. "Victoria Ashford," she said. He didn't recognize it. He told her that honestly. "My client was a passenger on Northbridge Flight 224. Oh, on April 14th, Elena Park said carefully. In seat 7A. She was recovered from the forward cabin." Brandon sat with that for a moment. Seat 7A. Third row, left side. Dark hair, blood at the hairline. The woman with the good face. "She's okay?" he said. He heard something shift in Elena Park's voice. Not a lot, just a fraction. "She is," she said. "Thanks to you." He looked through the windshield at the airport perimeter fence, at the scrubland beyond it, where the scorched earth was still visible even from here. "Okay," he said. "I'll take a call." He didn't tell Lily. Not about the letter, not about the call he'd agreed to. He wasn't sure why. Partly because she was 6 and these were grown-up complications, but partly because he'd gotten careful over the past 3 years about expecting things to come good. He'd learned what happened when the story you were telling yourself outpaced the story the world was actually writing. He picked her up from school, and she had a painting she'd made, a house with the disproportionately large sun that children always paint, yellow and generous. And she gave it to him in the truck with complete seriousness and said it was their house, and he said he loved it, and he meant it unreservedly. He put it on the refrigerator when they got home, covered the crack in the plaster almost. That night, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the bank notice and did the math again, as if the numbers might have changed since the last time he'd done it. They hadn't. They were exactly as bad as they'd always been. He had 4 days left on the bank's timeline. Outside, the April night was doing something that looked like it might become rain. The dogwood tree Clara had planted caught the porch light in its bare branches, all those small, hopeful fingers pointing upward. Brandon looked at it for a while. Then he turned out the kitchen light and went to bed. The call was scheduled for Thursday at noon. Brandon took it in his truck, parked at the far end of the airport employee lot where nobody went during lunch, engine off, windows fogging slightly from the cold. He'd brought a sandwich he didn't eat. He sat with the phone in his hand for about a minute before the call came through, looking at nothing in particular, telling himself this was probably going to be quick and simple and mean nothing. The voice that came on the line was not what he expected. He didn't know what he'd expected exactly. Someone polished, maybe. The particular smoothness of people who had staff handling their difficult conversations. Instead, the first thing Victoria Ashford said was, "I've been trying to find the right way to start this conversation for 2 weeks, and I still haven't figured it out." He said nothing. Let her continue. So I'm just going to say it directly. You pulled me out of that plane. You went back in twice more after that. And you apparently did all of this and then went and filed paperwork and didn't say a word to anyone. A pause. I needed to talk to the person who did that. Brandon looked through the windshield. A baggage cart was moving slowly across the tarmac in the distance. How are you doing? He asked. Physically? Concussion, 3 cracked ribs. My right arm had some soft tissue damage they were concerned about for a while, but it's resolving. Another pause, shorter this time. I was in the hospital for 9 days. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. That's part of what I... She stopped, started again. The people who told me what happened, what you did, you left before anyone could get your name. The first responders had a description. Male, work uniform, left before the media arrived. It took my team 10 days to find you. I wasn't hiding, he said. I know. That's almost the more baffling part. There was something in her voice that he couldn't quite categorize. Not quite frustration, not quite admiration. Something between the two. Mr. Hale. Brandon, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I generally do. Why did you go back in? After you got me out, why did you go back? He thought about it. He thought about it genuinely, because it was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. Not the kind of thing people said in these situations about instinct or not thinking or just doing what anyone would do, because that last one was specifically untrue. Most people didn't go back. There were more people, he said finally. I could hear them. Silence on the line. That's it? She said. That's it. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed texture, gone slightly rougher at the edges. Okay, she said. Okay. I wanted to ask that in person, actually. Would you be willing to meet? He'd been prepared for this. He'd told himself on the drive to work that morning that if she asked, he would say no politely, that he didn't want anything from this, that the conversation itself was sufficient. He'd been very clear with himself about this. When? He said. They met at a restaurant in Harrisburg, her choice, which he'd half expected to be somewhere with a dress code, but turned out to be a diner on the north side of the city that served breakfast all day and had vinyl booths with cracked seams repaired by electrical tape. Either she had people who found places like this, or she genuinely liked them. He couldn't tell which yet. She was already there when he arrived, sitting in the back booth, and he recognized her before he reached the table. Not from the crash, she'd been unconscious then, but from the photos he'd found when he looked her name up after the call. Victoria Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Capital Group, which held interests in logistics, real estate development, and 2 technology companies he'd actually heard of. 30 years old. Started the company at 23 using a combination of inheritance, what every profile described as unusual market instincts, and what she'd apparently described in one interview as a pathological inability to accept no. The profiles mentioned her father, who'd been a financier of some success before his death 6 years ago. They mentioned she was private, that she didn't do many interviews, that she was known in her industry for being difficult to read and harder to outmaneuver. The woman in the booth looked like someone coming off 9 days in a hospital. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of sleep had fully addressed yet. She was wearing a dark blue sweater and no jewelry except a watch that was expensive enough to be discreet about it. Her right arm rested on the table with the slight stiffness of tissue that was still repairing itself. She stood when he approached, which surprised him. "Brandon," she said. "Ms. Ashford." "Victoria." She said it the way people said it when they'd said it 1,000 times to people who called them something else. "Please, sit down." They sat. A waitress came quickly. Victoria had clearly been here long enough to establish a relationship with the staff, and they ordered coffee, and there was the small, awkward machinery of 2 strangers in an unusual situation negotiating how to begin. She started. "I looked into you." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "I figured you would. You were a senior structural analyst at Meridian Aerospace. Before that, MIT Aerospace Engineering. You left Meridian 2.5 years ago." "Yes." "Your personnel file at Meridian, the one I was able to access, describes your departure as voluntary resignation, but that's not exactly accurate, is it? It wasn't a question. He looked at her steadily. No, not exactly. What's the accurate version? He was quiet for a moment. The diner was doing moderate lunch business, the kind of ambient noise that made conversations private without making them feel hidden. He watched a man 2 tables over cut a piece of pie with methodical precision. I filed 8 internal safety reports over 14 months, he said. Specific failure modes in the CRJ 700 variant used by several regional carriers. Stress fractures in the engine pylon attachment assembly under certain thermal cycling conditions. The reports were reviewed, flagged as non-critical, and the recommended fixes were not implemented because the projected cost was $31 million across the affected fleet. He paused. I escalated to the FAA. The FAA responded. Meridian responded to the FAA. The FAA accepted Meridian's engineering counter-assessment. My reports were reclassified as speculative. Victoria was watching him with very still eyes. 3 months after the final reclassification, he continued, my wife was diagnosed. I took FMLA. When I came back, I was informed that my position had been restructured during my absence. I was offered a demotion to junior analyst. I declined and tendered my resignation. They waited until your wife was sick, Victoria said. They waited until I was distracted. He picked up the coffee. Smart timing. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving behind her expression that he couldn't read. Not pity, which he'd braced for, but something with more edges than pity. The crash, she said carefully. April 14th. The left engine failure. Engine pylon assembly failure, he said. The preliminary NTSB language, from what I was able to find in the public filings, is consistent with what I documented in 2019. The silence that followed had weight to it. You knew, she said. You knew that plane could fail like that. You tried to tell people, and they didn't listen. And then you... She stopped. And then you ran into it anyway. The people on that plane didn't make the decision to ignore my reports, he said. They just bought a ticket. Victoria set down her coffee cup. She pressed her fingers flat on the table, and he noticed that her right hand was doing it with slightly less force than the left, still compensating for the soft tissue injury. I want to help you, she said, with whatever's happening, whatever you need. I know you haven't asked, and I know you're probably going to resist the idea, and I'm telling you in advance that I have a great deal of patience for that particular kind of resistance. He almost smiled, just the edge of one. The bank, he said. She went very still. What bank? Is that not what you found when you looked into me? She hesitated. A fraction of a second, but it was there. I know your employment history, your credentials, the Meridian situation. She paused. Tell me about the bank. He told her. Not because he wanted her help, specifically. That complicated feeling he'd been carrying about this meeting was still unresolved, but because she'd been straight with him, and he was constitutionally incapable of being otherwise in return. He told her about the mortgage, the missed payments, the 4 months of partial payments while he tried to stabilize his finances on a maintenance technician's salary, the certified notices, the 11-day window that was now down to 3 days. He watched her face while he talked. She was good at keeping it composed, but not perfect. Her jaw tightened slightly on the foreclosure timeline. Keystone Regional Bank, she said when he finished. Yes. She wrote it down. Actually wrote it down, on a small notebook she produced from her bag, pen moving quickly. He noticed she wrote left-handed. I'm not asking you to do anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I came here because you asked me to, and I'm glad you're okay, and whatever happened between us on that runway, that's finished as far as I'm concerned. I understand what you're saying, she said, and I'm not offering charity. She met his eyes directly. What I'm offering is attention. I'm going to pay attention to your situation. What I do with that attention isn't charity, it's just what I do. He looked at her. You're a complicated person, he said. Yes, she agreed without any particular apology. I've been told. He drove home with the specific feeling of having opened a door he wasn't sure should have been opened. It wasn't a bad feeling. It wasn't a good one. It was the feeling of uncertainty, which he'd gotten enough of in the past 3 years that he could at least recognize it without it ambushing him entirely. Lily had spaghetti for dinner and told him a 17-minute story about a disagreement at school that had clearly reached mythological proportions in the retelling. He listened to all of it. He asked follow-up questions. He tucked her in and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the crescent moon nightlight and thought about Victoria Ashford's face when he told her about the bank, that tightening of the jaw, the way she'd written it down. He'd met determined people before. Aerospace was full of them, people who moved through the world with the specific momentum of those who expected outcomes to conform to their intentions. Clara had been like that, actually, focused in a way that had always slightly awed him, organized in ways that made his own scatterbrained approach to things look like a character defect, which it probably was. Victoria reminded him of that. Not of Clara, exactly, but of that quality. The way her eyes had gone very quiet and direct when she wrote down the bank's name. He turned out the light in Lily's room and went to bed. The next morning, the foreclosure notice arrived. Not the bank's final notice, he'd already had that. This was the formal legal filing, the paperwork that meant the clock was no longer theoretical. He read it at the kitchen table while Lily ate her cereal. The tiger box, she always wanted the tiger, and he read it twice to make sure he understood exactly what it said and what it meant. It meant the house was no longer simply at risk. It meant a process had begun that, unless interrupted, would result in him and his daughter losing the only home Lily clearly remembered. He folded the paper in thirds and put it in the drawer with the other papers. "Daddy," Lily said, "you're doing the face." "What face?" "The worried one, with the lines." She pointed at her own forehead, indicating specifically where the lines were, in case he was unclear. "I'm fine," he said. "You say that a lot." "It's true a lot." She considered this with the forensic skepticism of a 6-year-old who had been paying close attention to adults for her entire conscious life. "Okay," she said, in a tone that clearly meant I'm accepting this answer under protest. He got her to school on time, which was a minor personal triumph. Victoria called that afternoon. He was on the tarmac running a pre-departure check on a cargo turboprop when his phone buzzed. He stepped back from the aircraft, walked 20 feet, and answered. "I found some things," she said. No preamble. "About Keystone Regional Bank, do you have a few minutes?" "I'm at work." "I know, a few minutes." He looked over at the turboprop. It would wait. "Go ahead." Keystone Regional has initiated foreclosure proceedings on 47 properties in your county in the past 18 months, she said. The statewide average for a bank of its size is 12 to 15. The rate is 3 to 4 times normal. He processed that. Okay. The properties are not distributed randomly. 31 of the 47 are located in a specific geographic corridor, the area along Tanner Creek Road and the connecting streets east toward Route 44, including your address. Something shifted in the back of his mind. Not surprise exactly, more like the feeling of a shape becoming visible. That corridor, he said slowly, is where a proposed development project, Tanner Creek Commons, a mixed commercial and residential development, submitted its initial zoning application 14 months ago. He could hear papers moving on her end. The development company is Halcyon Property Group. They are not publicly affiliated with Keystone Regional Bank. Not publicly, he repeated. The chairman of Halcyon Property Group is a man named Douglas Merritt. Douglas Merritt sits on the board of directors of Keystone Regional Bank's parent holding company. A pause. He has held that seat for 9 years. Brandon was quiet. Brandon, I'm here. They're not foreclosing because you missed payments, she said. They're foreclosing because they want the land. He knew it. The moment she said it, he knew it was true the way you knew certain things. Not with surprise, but with the grim recognition of a pattern you'd sensed but hadn't fully let yourself see. He thought about Patricia at the housing nonprofit, the foreclosure numbers that had seemed high to her too, the way the bank had been uninterested in modification options. He thought about his neighbors, the Castillo family 3 houses down, who'd gotten their own notice. Old Mr. Vreeland on the corner, retired, fixed income, who'd been fighting his bank for 8 months. It wasn't random. It had never been random. How long have you known this? He asked. I've been working on it since yesterday, she said. I have people who are very good at this kind of research, but some of this is publicly available if you know what to look for. Another pause. I want to do something about it. What kind of something? The kind that requires capital and legal resources I have, and a legitimate reason to deploy them. He could hear something precise and controlled in her voice. Not cold, but contained, like something pointed. You gave me a reason, Brandon. He stood on the tarmac with his phone pressed to his ear and looked up at the flat gray Pennsylvania sky. There are other families, he said. It's not just my house. I know. A beat. I know it's not just yours. Those people. I know, she said for the third time, and something in the repetition told him that she'd already been thinking about exactly that. He exhaled. The cold air took it away from him in a thin white cloud. What do you need from me? He said. Nothing right now. I need you to not sign anything the bank sends you, and to forward everything they send to Elena Park's email. That's it. That's it. That's it. He thought about telling her it couldn't be that simple. He'd had enough experience with powerful institutions to know that what looked like a clear injustice from the outside looked, from the inside, like a perfectly legal business arrangement. Banks foreclosed on people all the time. Land got developed. The mechanism was real, and the documentation would be real, and anyone who tried to stop it would be walking into a wall of legal process that existed precisely to be walked into. He thought about saying all of this. He thought about the thin white cloud of his exhaled breath, already gone. Okay, he said. I'll be in touch, she said. This might take some time. I've got time, he said, which was nearly true. He had a little time. He had the specific time that existed between a foreclosure filing and an actual eviction, which was measured in weeks and which was not the same thing as real time, but would have to do. He didn't tell Lily about Victoria Ashford. He didn't tell Gerald about the call. He didn't tell anyone because there was nothing to tell yet. Just a conversation and a promise and a woman with a notebook writing down a bank's name. He went to work. He inspected aircraft and filed reports and signed forms and ate his lunch in the maintenance shed or in his truck, depending on the weather. He picked up Lily and listened to the proceedings of her day with the attention they deserved. He cooked dinner with variable success. He slept badly and woke early and stood sometimes at the kitchen window in the gray morning looking at the bare dogwood, waiting. He also, in the hours between Lily's bedtime and his own, pulled out his old documents. The Meridian files. He had copies, got everything. He was the kind of person who kept copies, who understood that paper was the only currency that didn't devalue when people decided to change their story. He had 8 safety reports, complete with technical analysis. He had the email chains, the ones where the responses had gotten increasingly perfunctory as the months went on. He had the FAA correspondence. He had the counter-assessment that Meridian had submitted, the one that had refuted his findings, and he had his own detailed technical rebuttal to that counter-assessment, which had never been formally received because by that point the process was already over. He read through them again at the kitchen table. The lamp was yellow and the house was quiet, and he read like a man preparing a case, because that's what he was doing, even if nobody had asked him to. The failure mode he'd identified in 2019 was specific: thermal cycling fatigue in the engine pylon attachment assembly of the CRJ 700 variant operated by regional carriers under high-frequency short route conditions. High-frequency short routes meant more takeoff and landing cycles per day, which meant more thermal cycling, which accelerated stress fracture propagation in a specific aluminum alloy component that Meridian had approved as sufficient, but that his analysis showed was operating at the edge of its fatigue life in high-use configurations. He had done the math. He had shown the math. He had been told the math was wrong by people whose financial interest in the math being wrong was not incidental. He looked at the preliminary NTSB findings he'd downloaded from the public portal. The language was careful, as it always was in preliminary reports. Engine separation event following apparent structural failure of the pylon assembly. They didn't speculate yet on cause. They wouldn't, not publicly, for months. But he knew what they would find. The weight of that, of having known, of having tried, of having been made to stop trying, was something he'd learned to carry without letting it pull him under. Some days he carried it better than others. Tonight he carried it the way you carry things at 2 a.m. with the house quiet around you, straight-backed and quiet and alone. He put the documents away, went to bed. Out. Victoria called again 8 days later. He was home when it came, a Saturday, Lily doing something complicated with construction paper at the kitchen table, glue stick involved, purpose as yet unclear. He took the phone to the back porch. "I need to tell you something," she said, and the quality of her voice told him immediately that this was different from the previous call, quieter, more careful. "Okay," he said. "I've been looking at the Keystone Regional situation. My team has been looking at it, and what we found—" A pause. "It's worse than I told you." He waited. "The foreclosure program isn't incidental to the development project. It's the engine. Halcyon Property Group needs a contiguous land corridor for the Tanner Creek development to qualify for the municipal tax incentives that make the project financially viable. Individual holdouts break the corridor. The bank's job, functionally, is to eliminate the holdouts." She stopped. "There are internal memos, communications between people at the bank and a consultant connected to Halcyon. We don't have them yet, but we know they exist. There's a documentation trail that points to them." "How did you find a trail you don't have yet?" "Because the absence of certain documents in a regulated institution's public record is itself informative," she said. "There are communication gaps, periods where you'd expect internal correspondence to exist, and there isn't any, which means someone cleaned the file, which means there was something worth cleaning." He thought about that, stood on the back porch with the late April cold still in the air, looking at the dogwood. Small leaves now, finally coming in, the tree deciding to live after all. "There are 47 families," he said. 47 filings. Some of those properties may have already transferred. We're looking at each one." "What are you going to do?" She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice had the particular flatness of someone stating a decision they'd already fully made. "I'm going to acquire the bank." He heard it, processed it. "You're going to buy it." Keystone Regional's parent holding company is not a large institution. It's regional, privately held, with 3 significant shareholders who I have reason to believe are not uniformly committed to the current management direction. Another pause. "Acquiring a majority position is achievable. It will take some time to structure properly, but it's achievable." "Victoria." He stopped, started again. That's a significant thing." "It is. You'd be doing it because of me." "I'd be doing it because 47 families are being systematically defrauded to benefit a real estate developer," she said. "You being one of those 47 is why I know about it, but you're not the reason I'm doing it." He stood with the phone and looked at the dogwood and its new leaves and thought about Clara planting it, the spring before she got sick, her hands in the dirt, the particular satisfaction she'd had in that, putting things in the ground and betting on them. "There's something else," Victoria said. "Go ahead." "The NTSB preliminary findings are going to expand. My attorneys have been in contact with investigators, carefully, nothing that looks like pressure. And the direction of the investigation is toward the pylon assembly. Your reports from 2019 are already in the record. The FAA is being asked quietly why they accepted Meridian's counter-assessment." She paused. "Someone remembered your name, Brandon. Someone in that investigation remembered the maintenance tech who ran into the crash site, knew a lot of specific things about how the plane failed." He was very still. "They're going to want to talk to you again," she said. "More seriously this time, with better questions." The late afternoon light was doing something particular to the dogwood, hitting the new leaves from the west, turning them gold at the edges. He'd noticed it before, but not quite like this. "You've been busy," he said. "I have." A brief pause that might have been something close to self-consciousness. "I told you I was going to pay attention to your situation." "You did say that." "I meant it." He wasn't sure what to say to that. The plain fact of someone meaning what they said, in his experience, was not something you could respond to adequately with words. He settled for, "Thank you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How's your daughter?" The question surprised him. Not the fact of it. She clearly knew he had a daughter she'd dug through his whole life, but the placement of it, the way she asked it after everything else, like she'd been waiting to. "She's good," he said. "She's inside making something out of construction paper. I'm not sure what yet." "How old?" "6. Does she know?" A pause. "About the house?" "No," he said. "She knows something's happening. She's perceptive, but no." He heard Victoria exhale slightly on the other end of the line. "My father died when I was 19, she said. It came out slightly sideways, like she hadn't fully planned to say it. I didn't know how bad things were until after. He'd been managing it alone for years." Another pause. I'm not comparing. It's okay," he said. "She's lucky," Victoria said, "to have a father who runs into burning planes for strangers, even if she doesn't know that part yet." He didn't have a response for that one either. He looked at the dogwood for a moment longer. "I'll keep the house secured," he said finally, "for whatever the process takes." "Good," she said. "I'll be in touch. Probably frequently. I'm told I'm intensive." "Noted," he said. He could almost hear her almost smile on the other end of the line. Almost. "Take care of yourself, Brandon," she said. "You too," he said. He stood on the back porch after the call ended, phone in his hand, the new leaves of the dogwood moving slightly in the April wind. Through the glass of the back door, he could see Lily at the kitchen table, deeply concentrated on whatever she was building, glue stick in hand, completely absorbed in the particular serious work of childhood. He watched her for a moment, then he went back inside. "What are you making?" he asked. Lily looked up. She considered the question carefully, the way she considered things that mattered. Then she looked back down at the construction paper. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I'll know when it's done." He sat down across from her and picked up a piece of construction paper and a pair of blunt scissors. "Want help?" he said. She looked at the scissors, looked at him, made a professional assessment. "Yes," she said, "but I'll tell you what to cut." "Fair enough," he said. Outside, the dogwood moved in the wind gold-edged and alive, and the day went on. The construction paper project turned out to be a bird. Lily announced this 3 days after the fact, holding it up for Brandon's inspection over breakfast. A lopsided shape with wings that went in slightly different directions, one eye drawn in red marker and one in blue because she'd run out of red halfway through and made an executive decision. "It's a good bird," Brandon said. "It's not done yet," she said. "Birds need more." He didn't ask what more. He'd learned that Lily's creative process didn't benefit from external input until she was ready for it. He put the bird carefully on the windowsill next to the kitchen table, where it caught the morning light and cast a small irregular shadow on the wall. That was the week the formal foreclosure notice appeared in the county property records. Public, searchable, the kind of thing that showed up when neighbors looked. Brandon knew because his neighbor Ray Castillo knocked on his door that Thursday evening, standing on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and the specific expression of a man who had bad news he'd been sitting with all day. Ray was 44, worked at the machine shop on Route 9, had lived on Tanner Creek Road for 11 years with his wife Denise and their 2 boys. He and Brandon were not close in the way of people who spent real time together, but they were the kind of neighbors who helped each other with things without keeping score. Brandon had fixed Ray's truck last October. Ray had shoveled Brandon's driveway after the February storm without being asked. "I saw it in the public records," Ray said. He wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. "I know," Brandon said. "They filed on us too, 2 weeks ago." Ray looked at the porch boards. Denise's parents might be able to help with some of it, but he stopped. "I don't know how this happened this fast. We were only behind 3 months. 3 months is enough," Brandon said. "For a bank that wants to foreclose, yeah." Ray looked up. "You think that's what this is?" Brandon leaned against the porch railing. The evening was cool, almost warm enough to be comfortable, but not quite there yet. Down the road, he could see old Mr. Vreeland's house with the porch light on, the light that had been on every evening for as long as Brandon had lived on this street. "I think the bank has interests that aren't about collecting debt," Brandon said carefully. "I can't prove it yet, but someone I know is working on it." Ray looked at him. "Who?" "Someone with resources." He paused. I know how it sounds, but I think you should hold on before you do anything with the bank. Don't sign modifications. Don't agree to anything. Ray was quiet for a long moment. The machine shop hadn't been having a great year, and Brandon knew it. The way people on the same street knew the general shape of each other's financial weather without discussing it directly. How long do we hold? Ray asked. I don't know exactly. Not long. Ray nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant he was registering the information and deciding whether to trust it. After a moment, okay, we'll hold. He paused. You doing all right? Yeah, Brandon said. I'm all right. Ray went home. Brandon stood on the porch a few minutes longer, watching Mr. Vreeland's light, thinking about the shape of the corridor Victoria had described. 31 properties along a specific stretch of land, systematically pressured toward transfer. He thought about how it looked from above, the way you thought about things when you'd spent years thinking about structural systems. Each individual property was a component. The corridor was the assembly, and the assembly was worth something that the individual components weren't, not separately, not without the whole. He went inside and called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. It was 9 o'clock, and she sounded like someone who had been working since before he'd woken up and would continue after he went to sleep. My neighbor, he said. Ray Castillo, Tanner Creek Road. They filed on him 2 weeks ago. He's on the list, she said. I know. He has 2 kids. I know that too, Brandon. He sat down at the kitchen table. How many of the 47 have kids? She paused. I haven't counted that specifically. It might be worth counting, he said, not as an accusation, just a fact. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. It would. Another pause, and then, the acquisition is moving. I've made contact with 2 of the 3 major shareholders in the parent holding company. One of them is amenable. The other is cautious but not hostile. She hesitated fractionally. The third is the problem. Who's the third? Douglas Merritt. He absorbed that. Merritt, the name she'd given him 3 weeks ago, the Halcyon Property Group chairman with the board seat. The man whose development project was the engine of all of this. He's a shareholder in his own scheme, Brandon said. Minority position, 15%. But he has a long relationship with the other shareholders, and he'll fight the acquisition if he knows it's coming, which means I need to move carefully and quickly in a specific sequence. She was talking faster now, the way she talked when she was moving through a problem in real time. There's a board meeting in 3 weeks. If I can consolidate majority control before that meeting, the agenda changes. What does the agenda change to? An emergency management review, change of direction on the foreclosure program, and a full internal audit which will expose the Merritt connection. She paused. I also have a meeting with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities next week. My legal team has prepared a preliminary complaint. The documentation isn't complete yet, but it's enough to open a regulatory inquiry. Brandon looked at the kitchen window. The bird Lily had made was on the sill, its mismatched eyes looking out at the dark. Victoria, he said, how much of your own capital is this? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had a slight careful quality. Enough. That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving. He heard something that might have been her moving in a chair. It's an investment with a viable return structure. Acquiring a regional bank is not charity, Brandon. Distressed institutions can be restructured. If the predatory program is dismantled and the management is cleaned out, there's a legitimate banking operation underneath it. And if it doesn't work out that way, then I'll have made an expensive mistake while doing the right thing, she said. I've made expensive mistakes before. They didn't kill me. He thought about the plane, the way she'd said they didn't kill me, and the specific irony of that in context. There's something else I need to tell you, she said, about the NTSB investigation. He went still. Go ahead. My attorneys were contacted by investigators today, not informally this time. They've requested access to your full technical documentation from the Meridian period, the 8 reports and all associated correspondence. A pause. The pylon assembly failure they found in the wreckage matches the failure mode you described. Specifically, the metallurgical analysis is consistent with the thermal cycling fatigue mechanism you identified in your 2019 report. The kitchen was very quiet. Brandon, I'm here. They were going to dismiss your reports. They did dismiss them. But now they have physical evidence from a crash site that is a precise match for your documented analysis. Her voice was careful, steady. This is different from before. This isn't a regulatory body accepting a manufacturer's counter-assessment. This is crash investigators looking at wreckage and matching it to engineering documentation that was suppressed. Not suppressed, he said automatically. Reclassified as speculative. Same outcome, she said. He knew she was right about that. He'd known it for years, had been carrying the knowledge in the way you carried things you couldn't change. But now it was no longer just something he knew. It was something that existed in a formal investigation, in metallurgical reports, in the careful language of federal crash analysis. How many other aircraft? He started and then stopped. Victoria understood the question he hadn't finished. My attorneys are asking the same question, she said quietly. The FAA is being asked how many CRJ 700 aircraft in the regional fleet were covered by Meridian's 2019 counterassessment and have not had the pylon assembly inspected. He pressed his hand flat on the kitchen table. The wood was solid and real under his palm. There could be other planes, he said. Yes, she said. There could be. If they're still flying. I know. Her voice was precise and tight. My attorneys are pushing for an emergency airworthiness directive. The FAA does not move fast. They are being strongly encouraged to move faster. Brandon thought about the 8 reports he'd filed, the 14 months of documentation, the meeting where a senior Meridian executive had looked at his analysis with the particular glazed expression of a man whose primary objection was financial. He thought about the cost figure, $31 million across the affected fleet, which had been the wall that his evidence had failed to breach. He thought about the first officer in the cockpit of Flight 2240 who hadn't survived. Okay, he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. What do you need me to do? I need you to go through your documentation again tonight or tomorrow and make sure everything is organized and complete. Dates, report numbers, correspondence chains, everything. I'm sending you a secure document portal. Elena will email you the access. Upload everything there. My attorneys need to review it before it goes to the NTSB formally. I already have it organized, he said. Of course you do. He heard a brief softening in her voice. Brandon, this is important. What you documented. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't speculative. You were right. He sat with that for a moment. 3 years of being wrong or being treated as wrong, which functionally amounted to the same thing. And now someone was telling him he'd been right. He'd known he was right. He'd always known. But knowing and being told were different experiences, and the difference hit him somewhere between the chest and the throat. He didn't say anything for a moment. You still there? She said. Yeah, he said. I'm here. He uploaded the documents the next morning, before work, while Lily slept. He went through each file with the thoroughness of someone who understood that precision was the only form of protection available to him in this territory. Report numbers, dates, the specific names of the executives who had received and signed off on the responses. The FAA correspondence reference numbers. The counter-assessment document with its author's credentials and his own point-by-point technical rebuttal. He uploaded it all. Sent Elena Park a message confirming it was complete. Then he went to wake Lily for school and burned the toast. Daddy, she said. I know, he said. That's really bad this time. I know. She looked at the smoke rising from the toaster with philosophical resignation. Can we have the tiger cereal? Yes, he said. We can have the tiger cereal. The following 2 weeks moved in a strange, doubled rhythm. On the surface, ordinary life, the airport, and the inspections, and the paperwork, and Gerald asking him cautiously about the FAA interviews, and him saying it was ongoing, and Gerald nodding with the expression of a man who understood when not to dig. Lily's school, and her daily forensic reports on the proceedings of first grade and the bird on the windowsill getting additional features as she decided what more meant. A second eye in red eventually, because she found a red marker behind the couch cushions, and something she described as a crown but was more architecturally ambitious than any crown Brandon had seen. Underneath the surface, the other thing. Victoria called every 2 or 3 days. Sometimes it was short, a quick update, an answer to a question her team had sent. Sometimes it was longer. She was in Philadelphia mostly, working with her attorneys, in meetings with shareholders and banking regulators. She moved through these conversations with a speed and specificity that he'd started to understand was simply how she operated. Not impatient exactly, but with a very low tolerance for vagueness. She wanted specifics. She asked for them directly, and when you gave them, she absorbed them completely and moved. He'd met very few people who listened the way she listened. Clara had listened that way. He didn't examine the comparison too closely. They started talking about other things, occasionally. Not deliberately. It was never a call that started as personal conversation, but it happened in the margins of the larger things, in the places where the business of crisis paused for a moment. She asked about Lily again. Specifically, actually, not the general, how is your daughter, but about particular things he'd mentioned in passing. The bird, the SpongeBob backpack, whether she'd figured out what more meant yet. He told her about the crown. Victoria laughed, a real one, brief and slightly surprised at itself. Not the professional warmth he'd initially expected from someone of her position. She had a laugh that sounded like it didn't get enough use. My father would have liked her, she said. Then, sorry, I don't know why I said that. It's okay, he said. He was an engineer, she said. Different kind, civil, but he had that quality. The one where they see the problem inside the thing, where other people see the surface and they see the structure underneath. A pause. You have that. Sometimes it's more trouble than it's worth, he said. He used to say the same thing. They were quiet for a moment, a comfortable quiet which was its own kind of development. How old were you? He asked. When he died. 19. It was a heart attack. Another pause. Quick, which people say is a mercy. I've never fully agreed. No, he said. Quick isn't always better. How long did Clara... 6 weeks from diagnosis. That's not long enough, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. He heard her exhale quietly. I'm sorry, she said. And it was the specific kind of I'm sorry that meant something rather than filling space. The kind from people who'd had their own occasion to receive it and knew its weight. Thank you, he said. The call went back to the acquisition timeline after that, the way calls between them did. But something had shifted in the texture of the conversations after that, a slight additional warmth that neither of them commented on. The call he'd been waiting for came on a Tuesday. It was from an NTSB investigator named Leonard Cross, who had a voice like someone who had spent 30 years in conference rooms delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. He was professional and precise and told Brandon that the investigation had reached a stage where his technical documentation was being formally incorporated as primary evidence. Your 2019 reports, Cross said, and your rebuttal of the counter-assessment. Yes. The metallurgical analysis of the recovered pylon assembly is consistent with your documented failure mode. We're treating your analysis as substantively accurate. Brandon was in the truck again. Same parking spot, same part of the employee lot. He'd started coming here instinctively for significant calls, something about the specific quality of silence available in a parked vehicle in a place nobody came. The counter-assessment, he said. Meridian's counter-assessment. What happens to that? It is being reviewed, Cross said carefully, as part of a broader inquiry into the regulatory response to your original reports. The FAA is conducting a separate internal review of the 2019 decision chain. How many aircraft? Brandon said. A pause. Excuse me? How many CRJ 700s are currently operating under the regional carrier certifications that were covered by the Meridian counter-assessment? Without the pylon inspection, my reports recommended. A longer pause. That is something we are actively assessing, Cross said. Are they still flying? Mr. Are those aircraft currently in service? I can tell you, Cross said slowly, that we have issued an emergency airworthiness directive effective as of this morning that requires pylon assembly inspection on all CRJ 700 aircraft in the affected certification group before next flight. That directive applies to 63 aircraft operated by 7 regional carriers. 63. Brandon pressed his hand against his sternum for a moment, the way you did when something hit you physically. 63 aircraft grounded for inspections that should have been done 3 years ago, prompted by a crash that killed a first officer and nearly killed 42 other people. Thank you, he said. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate. Mr. Hale, I want to be direct with you. The question of why your original reports were not acted upon, that is going to be answered, fully. Cross's voice had something different in it now, less formal. What you documented was correct. The process failed. That failure will have consequences. Brandon looked through the windshield. The runway was visible from where he sat. The same runway, the same threshold, the same scrubland beyond it, where the scorched earth had slowly greened over with the advancing spring. Will you need me to testify? He said. Almost certainly, Cross said. When the time comes, yes. Okay, Brandon said. I'll be ready. Oh. He called Victoria from the same parking spot, right after Cross hung up. She answered before the first ring finished. I heard, she said, how my attorneys have a contact at the FAA field office. The directive was issued this morning. Her voice had an edge to it, not excitement, something more contained than that. 63 aircraft, Brandon. I know. They would have kept flying. If the crash hadn't happened, if the investigation hadn't matched your documentation, I know, he said again. She stopped. He could hear her breathing, slightly uneven. Are you okay? He thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, he said. I think I will be. I just need a minute. Take it, she said. He sat in the parked truck and took the minute. The spring afternoon was doing something generous outside. Actual warmth in the sun for the first time. The kind that had weight behind it. The kind that meant the season had finally committed. He could see it on the scrubland beyond the fence, the green coming back in patches, the ground recovering. Okay, he said finally. The bank meeting is Friday, she said. The board meeting I told you about, I've secured 53%. A pause. I'll have the votes to remove the current president and install an interim management team. The foreclosure program gets suspended immediately pending internal audit. All 47 properties. All active foreclosure proceedings halt, the ones that have already transferred. There may be legal mechanisms for those, depending on what the audit finds. I can't promise all of them, but the active ones stop. He thought about Ray Castillo's face on the porch, the specific weight of a man who had 11 years in a house and didn't know if he had more. What about Merritt? He said. Merritt will fight the audit. He'll know what it means for him when the internal communications are exposed. She paused. But he no longer has the board majority to stop it. And the documentation trail you mentioned, the cleaned files. The audit team will find what's there to find. And what was deleted leaves traces if you know where to look, which my people do. Her voice was flat and focused. Douglas Merritt has been very careful for a long time. Careful people tend to believe that means they're safe. They're usually wrong. Brandon thought about the Meridian executive who'd looked at his safety reports with glazed financial patience, about the FAA reviewer who'd accepted the counter-assessment, about the entire institutional machinery by which expensive inconveniences got reclassified as speculative until they weren't speculative anymore, and a plane came down in Pennsylvania scrubland and a first officer didn't come home. The pattern, he said. What you found. The bank. The development corridor. Merritt's position. How long has this been going on? The foreclosure program in this specific form started 22 months ago, Victoria said. But the relationship between the bank and Halcyon goes back considerably further. The development project was first proposed internally 6 years ago. It's been a long, careful campaign. 6 years, he said. Yes. Some of these families, he thought about the Vreeland house and its perpetual porch light. They've been in their homes for decades, They're not just a position in a land corridor. I know, she said. That's why we're doing this. He appreciated that she said we. He didn't call attention to it, but he registered it. Brandon? Her voice had changed slightly, gone a degree more personal. Can I ask you something that isn't about any of this? He was surprised enough that he said yes before thinking about it. When you ran into the crash site, she said, that day, you'd been through everything you've been through. The Meridian thing, Clara. 3 years of things not going right. A pause. And you still ran in. He waited to see where she was going. I've been thinking about that, she said, for weeks. I keep coming back to it. Because I've met a lot of people who have every reason to stop caring about things outside their own situation, and most of them do stop. They protect what's left. She paused again. You didn't. He thought about it, the honest version. I didn't have time to think about whether to stop, he said. The people were there and I could help them. That's all it was. That's not all it was. Victoria, it's not a small thing, she said with a firmness that didn't invite argument. I just wanted you to know that I see it, whatever you say about it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon was doing its generous spring thing, and the scrubland beyond the fence was green and recovering, and he sat in the truck and let someone see it, the way she was asking to. Thank you, he said. Okay, she said. Friday, the board meeting. I'll call you after. I'll be here, he said. He picked up Lily at the regular time, and she got in the truck and immediately said, Something happened today. Something happened to you today? He said, No, to you. She buckled her seatbelt with the focus of a professional. You have a different face. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was watching him with the specific attention she applied to things she'd decided were important. I got some good news today, he said, about some things I've been working on. She processed this. Good news about the house? He paused. He'd been careful about the house, about what Lily knew. She was perceptive. She'd said so herself, in her own 6-year-old terms. And he knew she was aware that something was wrong, the way children were aware of the general temperature of a household's anxiety without knowing the specific numbers. Working on it, he said. She looked at him in the mirror for another moment. Then she seemed to decide this was an acceptable answer. Mrs. Petrova says I'm good at math, she said, shifting with the speed of thought to her primary concerns. I know, he said. You're very good at math. She says I'm the best in the class at grouping. What's grouping? This produced a detailed explanation that lasted most of the drive home. He listened to all of it. By the time they got to Tanner Creek Road, he understood grouping considerably better than he had before. He made dinner, successfully, remarkably, chicken and rice that was genuinely edible, and they ate at the kitchen table with the bird on the windowsill watching them with its mismatched eyes. Lily told him she'd decided what more meant. The crown wasn't sufficient. The bird needed a story. What kind of story? He asked. The kind where it goes somewhere and comes back, she said. With something. What does it come back with? She thought about it, picked up her fork. I don't know yet, she said, but something good. He looked at the bird on the windowsill. Its lopsided wings, its ambitious crown, its 2 different colored eyes looking outward at whatever was coming. Yeah, he said. Something good. The April evening settled around the house. Down the road, Mr. Vreeland's porch light came on like it always did. Ray Castillo's truck was in the driveway next to the Castillo house. The dogwood at the corner of the yard had fully leafed out now, green and substantial, committed to the season. Brandon cleared the dishes and washed them in the sink, and thought about the board meeting on Friday, and thought about 63 aircraft being inspected in hangars across the country, and thought about the sound his back had made when he'd pushed that collapsed seat off Victoria Ashford's arm. He wasn't sure, when he thought about all of it, how to hold it as a single thing. It was too many things. The grief and the loss and the anger and the years of being dismissed and the crash and the burning and the bank and the investigation. And now this. The possibility, slowly materializing, that the machinery might actually work in the right direction for once. He wasn't sure he believed it yet. He'd been careful about believing things. But the dish in his hand was clean and solid, and the kitchen light was on, and through the window he could see the dogwood moving gently in the spring wind, and Lily was at the table adding to the bird's story with a confidence that brooked no uncertainty whatsoever. He decided he could wait until Friday to know more. For now, this was enough. Friday came the way significant days always came, looking exactly like any other day until it didn't. Brandon dropped Lily at school, went to work, inspected a turboprop and 2 regional jets, ate half a sandwich at his workstation, and waited. Gerald asked him twice if he was all right, which meant he was doing a poor job of appearing normal. He told Gerald he was fine. Gerald did the nod that meant he didn't believe it but would respect the fiction. The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. He was in the maintenance shed when his phone buzzed. He walked outside into the May sun, real warmth now, the kind that had finally committed, and answered. "It's done," Victoria said. 2 words. But the quality of her voice when she said them told him everything about what the preceding 4 hours had looked like. "Tell me," he said. He heard her exhale, long, controlled, the exhale of someone who had been holding something at significant tension and was carefully releasing it. "We called the meeting to order at 10. Merritt's attorney attempted to challenge the validity of the shareholder notification on procedural grounds. That took 40 minutes to resolve, which was the attorney doing his job, but also Merritt buying time to make calls." A pause. The calls didn't help him. The vote went 53-47. Raymond Price, the current bank president, is removed effective immediately. An interim management team takes over today. "The foreclosure program," Brandon said. "Suspended, all active proceedings. As of this afternoon, no further foreclosure actions will be taken on any property in the affected corridor until the internal audit is complete." Her voice was steady, but he could hear something underneath it, something that was either exhaustion or relief, or both inseparable. "Your property, Ray Castillo's, Mr. Vreeland's, all of them. The clock stopped today." Brandon put his hand on the exterior wall of the maintenance shed. The corrugated metal was warm from the sun. He pressed his palm flat against it and just stood there for a moment. "Brandon?" "I'm here," he said. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." His voice came out slightly rough. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, I'm okay." "There's more," she said. Merritt walked out of the meeting before the vote concluded. His attorney tried to file a preliminary injunction to block the management transition. We anticipated that our legal team was ready. The injunction was denied within the hour. Another pause. "But Merritt is not finished. I want you to understand that. He has resources and relationships, and he is angry in the specific way that people are angry when they've been operating with impunity for a long time and suddenly aren't." "What does that mean practically?" "It means the fight isn't over. The audit will take weeks. The regulatory investigation will take longer. At some point, there will be legal action. Probably multiple actions in multiple directions. This is going to get complicated before it gets clean." She said it without apology, just straight. "I wanted you to know that." "I figured," he said. "These things don't just stop." "No, they don't." A brief pause. "But the direction changed today. The foreclosure program is suspended. The audit is happening. And the people who have been working in darkness now have a spotlight on them that isn't going away." He looked out at the runway. The same runway. The same scrubland beyond the fence, green now, the scorched earth fully covered. "How are you?" he asked. A slight pause, surprised maybe by the directness of the question aimed back at her. "Tired," she said. "I've been in a conference room since 7 this morning, and I have 3 more calls this afternoon, and I have a headache that started Wednesday and hasn't stopped." "Have you eaten today?" "I had coffee." "Victoria." "I'll eat. Elena will make me eat. She has a system." He heard something that might have been a brief wry smile in her voice. "I need to go, but I wanted you to know first." "Thank you," he said. "Brandon." Her voice shifted slightly. "What you started, running into that aircraft, look at what it became. I know you don't think of it that way. I know you'd say you just heard people in there, but look at what it became." He didn't have a response for that. He didn't try to make one. "Go home and tell your daughter," she said. "The house is safe." He stood in the May sun after she hung up, hand still flat against the warm metal wall, looking at the green scrubland and the blue spring sky, and he let himself feel it, fully, without the careful management he'd applied to hope for the past 3 years. He let it be real. Then he went back inside and finished his shift, because the aircraft didn't inspect themselves. He told Ray Castillo that evening, knocked on his door at 6:30, after dinner, after Lily was set up with her construction paper and the ongoing bird saga. Ray answered in his work clothes, still had the machine shop smell on him, and Brandon said it simply. The foreclosure program was suspended. All active proceedings, including Ray's, were on hold. There would be an audit. Ray looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned back into the house and called out, "Denise, come here." Denise Castillo came to the door. She was a small, composed woman who Brandon had always liked because she was direct without being unkind, the kind of person who said what she meant and meant what she said. She looked at her husband's face, then at Brandon's. "It stopped," she said. "Not a question." "For now," Brandon said, "there's more to happen, but the active proceedings are suspended." Denise put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she took it away and said, "Who? Who did this?" "Someone I know," Brandon said. "Someone who found out what was happening and decided to do something about it." Ray shook his head slowly. "Just like that." "Not just like that," Brandon said. "It was a lot of work." Ray stuck out his hand. Brandon shook it. Denise hugged him, which he hadn't expected, and it was the specific hug of someone who had been carrying a weight and felt it lift, brief and fierce. He went down the road to Mr. Vreeland's house. The old man answered in his bathrobe, which was his standard evening attire, and listened to Brandon carefully and then said, "The bank is run by thieves." "The people running it are being removed," Brandon said. "The audit starts next week." Mr. Vreeland looked at him from under his eyebrows. He was 73 and had a veteran's particular economy with words. "You're doing," he said. "Partly," Brandon said. "What's the other part?" "A woman I know." Mr. Vreeland was quiet for a moment. The porch light hummed above them. "Good woman?" he asked. Brandon thought about Victoria Ashford in a diner booth with her right arm slightly stiff and her notebook out, writing down the bank's name. Thought about her voice on 100 calls, precise and direct, and occasionally, in the margins, something else entirely. "Yes," he said. Mr. Vreeland nodded with the specific gravity of a man filing information for future consideration. "Bring her around sometime," he said. "I make good coffee." "I'll tell her that," Brandon said. He told Lily that night. Not everything. She was 6, and the full architecture of predatory real estate development was not age-appropriate content, but the part she needed. He sat on the edge of her bed after her bath, while she was in her pajamas with the rabbit on the chest, and he said, "You know how I've been worried about the house?" She looked at him very carefully. "Yes." "It's going to be okay," he said. "We're keeping the house." She held still for a moment. He couldn't fully read her expression. It was something complicated for a 6-year-old, something that had layers. Then she said, "I knew we were." "Yeah?" "I put it in the bird story," she said, completely matter-of-fact. "The bird comes back to the same place, so I knew we were staying." He looked at her for a moment. "That's not exactly how things work, Lily." "I know," she said, "but I put it in anyway." He tucked her in, smoothed the blanket the specific way, put the glass of water on the nightstand, sat there in the dark with the crescent moon nightlight casting its small, soft glow, and listened to her breathing settle into sleep, and thought about what she'd said about the bird. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a while. The house was quiet. The bird on the windowsill had its crown and its mismatched eyes, and now, apparently, a story in which it always came home. He poured a glass of water and stood at the window and looked at the dark yard and the dogwood and the May night, and he thought about Clara. Not the sad version, not the hospital version, not the 6 weeks version, the earlier version. Clara on a Sunday morning in this kitchen, making actual competent eggs, talking about something she'd read, her hair not quite done yet. Clara in the yard with her hands in the dirt, planting the dogwood, satisfied in a way that was entirely her own. He thought she would have found all of this: Victoria, the bank, the aircraft, the years of it coming to this particular point, both infuriating and somehow ultimately correct. Clara had believed, against most available evidence, that things tended toward fairness if you pushed hard enough. He had been more skeptical. He was still more skeptical, but the events of the past weeks were making it harder to hold that skepticism as cleanly as he had. He went to bed, slept better than he had in weeks, which wasn't saying much, but still. The audit began 8 days later. An independent firm, appointed by the new interim management at Victoria's direction, went into Keystone Regional Bank's records with the specific thoroughness of people who knew what they were looking for and why. Brandon was not party to the audit directly. He got his information from Victoria, who got it from her legal team, who got it from the audit firm's preliminary reports. What they found was methodical and ugly. The internal communication gaps, the cleaned files Victoria had identified weeks ago, turned out to be the surface of something considerably deeper. The audit firm found deletion logs. Not the deletions themselves, but the records of deletions, which existed in backup systems that the cleanup hadn't reached. The logs showed a pattern of communication removal beginning approximately 16 months ago, around the time the regulatory environment around foreclosure practices had begun attracting attention in the state legislature. Someone had been careful. Someone had cleaned the files in advance of scrutiny that hadn't arrived yet, which meant the scheme was premeditated not only in its commission, but in its concealment. Merritt's consultant, Victoria told him in a call that ran past 10 o'clock. There's a communications chain, partial, the deletions are real, some of it is genuinely gone. But what remains shows coordination between the consultant, a man named Philip Garrett, and at least 2 officers inside the bank, including Raymond Price. The directives for the foreclosure target list came from outside the bank. Price implemented them internally. Garrett is Merritt's man? Brandon said. Garrett is technically an independent real estate consultant. He has worked exclusively with Halcyon Property Group for the past 4 years. She paused. The Pennsylvania AG's office has been briefed. They are now formally involved. Brandon sat with the weight of that. The Attorney General. This had moved beyond civil, beyond regulatory. This was criminal territory. Merritt, he said, does he know how bad it is? His attorneys know, Victoria said. Which means he knows. A pause. He made 3 attempts to contact me this week, through intermediaries. I declined to respond. What did he want? The intermediaries framed it as wanting to discuss an amicable resolution. Her voice had a dry precision on those last 2 words, which in my experience means he wants to negotiate a version of events that leaves him with fewer consequences. What did you say? I said the audit would proceed and the findings would go where they went, and I had nothing to negotiate. How did he take that? I'm told he was not pleased. She paused. I've stopped being concerned with whether Douglas Merritt is pleased. Brandon almost smiled. How's the headache? Gone, she said. Elena made me eat. It helped. A brief pause. How's Lily? The bird has a name now, he said. Apparently. What's the name? Marco, he said. A brief silence. Why Marco? I asked the same thing. The answer was because it sounds right. I've learned not to push further than that. Victoria laughed, the brief, real one that still sounded like it surprised her slightly every time. That's very solid reasoning, she said. 6-year-old logic is internally consistent, he said. It just uses different axioms. Your daughter sounds like someone I'd like to meet, she said. And then, slightly more carefully, if that would be all right. He was quiet for a moment, not because the idea surprised him. He'd been aware of its eventual inevitability for weeks, without quite admitting that to himself, but because saying yes meant something, in the specific way that things said out loud meant something different from things merely felt. Yeah, he said. That would be all right. Ought. The next weeks were not clean. Victoria had told him they wouldn't be, and she was right. Merritt filed suit against the holding company's majority shareholders, alleging that the acquisition process had violated shareholder agreements. The suit was without substantial merit, according to Victoria's attorneys, but it required response, and generated delay and cost, and the particular grinding stress of legal process when deployed as a weapon. He filed a second suit against the audit firm, alleging bias and improper disclosure. This one was also without merit and was also a weapon. Brandon watched all of this from Millhaven with the detached recognition of someone who had seen institutions fight to protect themselves. He filed his own documentation with the NTSB on schedule, testified in a preliminary hearing before a federal aviation board via video call from a conference room in a Harrisburg law office that Victoria's team arranged. He wore the same jacket he'd worn to the diner that first time. He answered every question with precision and completeness. He named names when asked to name names. The Meridian counter-assessment from 2019 was formally repudiated in a published NTSB finding. The language was careful. NTSB findings always were. But the meaning was unambiguous. The assessment had been flawed, the flaws had been consequential, and the decision-making process that led to the acceptance of the flawed assessment was under review. He was in the truck when he read it on his phone. The same parking spot, same part of the lot. He read it twice. Then he sat there for a long time doing nothing in particular except being there. He called Victoria. "I saw it," she said immediately. "The language," he said. "They're careful. They're saying what they can say at this stage," she said. "But Brandon, flawed, consequential, under review. In NTSB language, that's as close to they were wrong, and it cost someone their life, as you'll get in a published finding." "I know," he said. "How do you feel?" He thought about it. The honest version again. "I don't know how to feel about being right about something this bad," he said. "I wanted to be wrong. I spent years hoping I'd missed something, that their counter-assessment would hold up, that the planes would keep flying and nothing would happen." He paused. "Because if I was right, it meant people were going to be hurt," she said quietly. "And they were. And you tried to stop it, and you couldn't." A pause. "That's not on you." "I know it's not on me," he said. "Knowing it's not on me and feeling it's not on me are different things." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "they are." They stayed on the phone without speaking for a while. He didn't know when that had started being a thing they could do, sit in shared silence without it being awkward. But it had happened somewhere in the weeks of calls, and it was, he'd decided, one of the more useful things about her. "My attorneys think merit suits are going to be resolved within 60 days, she said eventually. "Both of them are delay tactics, and the courts don't like delay tactics." "And after?" "After the audit findings go to the AG formally. At that point it becomes a criminal matter and moves out of my hands." She paused. "Which is where it belongs." "Price," he said, "the former bank president." "His attorneys have been very active this week," she said, in a tone that communicated clearly what that likely meant. People in his position tend to cooperate when they're looking at what he's looking at. Brandon understood what that meant too. Price was going to talk. Price was going to give them merit directly, because Price was not a man who had invented this scheme. He was a man who had implemented it, and the gap between those two positions was exactly the gap that prosecutorial discretion used. "The families," he said, "the ones whose properties transferred before the suspension. My attorneys are working through them individually. Some of the transfers may be reversible on grounds of fraud in the foreclosure process, if the audit finds what I think it's going to find. Others, She paused. "Some of them may not be reversible. I want to be honest about that. We may not get everyone back whole." "What can you do for the ones who can't go back?" "Compensation, financial remedy from whatever judgment comes out of the criminal process, if I can influence the terms of any civil settlement." She paused. "I've also established a fund, independently of the legal process, for families in the corridor who suffered losses." She said it in the tone of someone who hadn't planned to mention it yet and was slightly annoyed at themselves for doing so. "You established a fund," he said. "It's not—" She stopped. "It's not a gesture. It's a practical mechanism for people who may be waiting years for a legal judgment." Victoria. "What?" "Stop explaining it away." A pause. "I'm not explaining it away." "You're doing the thing where you frame everything as practical," he said. So it doesn't sound like you care. Silence. He'd gone further than he usually did. He sat with that for a moment, not taking it back. You're not wrong, she said finally. Her voice was slightly different. Old habit. I know, he said. Me too. The confrontation with Merritt, because that's what it was, even though it happened in a conference room with attorneys present on both sides, came on a Thursday in June, 6 weeks after the board meeting. Victoria had not told Brandon about the meeting in advance. He found out afterward when she called him at 7 in the evening from what sounded like a car. She sounded different from any version of herself he'd heard in the weeks of calls. Not damaged, not shaken, something else. Compressed, maybe. Like she'd been through something with high internal pressure and the pressure hadn't fully equalized yet. He wanted to negotiate, she said, in person. His attorney said he had information that would benefit the investigation if there was an agreement about his own exposure. Did he? Brandon said. He had documents, she said. Documents from the Halcyon internal files that he claimed showed the development project was viable and legitimate and that the bank's foreclosure program was a coincidence of market timing. A pause. He presented them like he was doing me a favor. And my attorneys had already obtained most of those documents through the discovery process. The ones he brought that were new, the audit team will review them. But the idea that they changed the analysis is... She stopped. He sat across the table from me and explained very calmly that what had happened to those families was the market operating normally and that I had misunderstood the situation. Brandon said nothing, waited. He was so sure, she said. That's what I keep coming back to. He was so sure I was going to find his explanation reasonable. That kind of certainty. It only comes from never having been told no. A pause. I told him the audit findings were going to the AG on schedule and that nothing he'd brought to the meeting changed that. How did he respond? He said I'd made a significant mistake. She said it evenly. His exact words were, "You've made a significant mistake by making an enemy of me," which is the kind of thing people say when they've run out of other things to say. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said. But then, after a pause, he reminded me of someone. The way he presented it all, very reasonable, very controlled, very certain that the framework he was operating in was the only framework there was. Another pause. The Meridian executive, the one who dismissed your reports. Brandon went very still. The same pattern, she said. The certainty. The absolute confidence that money and position were sufficient arguments. Her voice had something in it now, rougher at the edges. And you sat across from that certainty, alone, for 14 months, and you kept filing the reports anyway. Victoria, but I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I've been in that room all day, and I've been thinking about what it cost you to just keep going, when nobody was listening and the institution kept telling you that you were wrong. I wasn't the only one who paid for it, he said carefully. The first officer. I know, she said. I know. I'm not trying to make it about you only. I'm saying I understand something now that I understood differently before. A pause. I was in a room with the kind of man who does those things, and I wanted... She stopped again. You wanted to make him understand what it cost, Brandon said. Silence. Yes, she said. And he never will. That's the thing about people like that. They don't experience cost the same way. No, he said. They don't. She was quiet for a moment. He heard a traffic sound, someone honking distantly on her end, the ordinary noise of a city evening. Are you in a car? He said. Walking, actually. I needed air after the meeting. He looked out his kitchen window at the June evening. The dogwood in full leaf now, the yard deep green, the last of the daylight still on the upper branches. Where are you walking? He said. I don't know yet, she said, and then slightly surprised at herself. I've been doing that more lately, walking without knowing where. Is that new? It's... yes. Relatively new? A pause. I used to have every hour scheduled. What changed? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet and slightly sideways, the way it got when she was saying something she hadn't planned to. I started thinking differently about what's worth the time, she said. That's what changed. The news about Price broke 2 weeks later. Raymond Price, former president of Keystone Regional Bank's parent holding company, had entered into a cooperation agreement with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. The AG's formal announcement was brief and technical. Cooperation agreements always were, but the implications were unmissable. Price was giving them the full chain, the directives, the communication with Garrett, the meetings with Merritt that the deleted files had only partially concealed. Brandon read it on his phone during his lunch break, sitting on an overturned equipment crate in the maintenance shed with the May sun coming through the open door. Gerald came in to get something from the supply shelf and saw his face. "Good news or bad?" Gerald said. "Good," Brandon said. "I think the complicated kind." Gerald thought about this. "Complicated good is still good," he said. "That's a reasonable position," Brandon said. Gerald got his supply and left, and Brandon sat in the shaft of sunlight and read the announcement again, looking for the specific language that told him how serious this was. Cooperation agreement was serious. Full disclosure of relevant communications was serious. Criminal charges pending against additional parties was the most serious thing of all. He called Victoria. She answered on the first ring. "I know," she said. "How long have you known?" "The AG's office called my attorneys this morning. I've known since 9. "Why didn't you?" "I was waiting until it was public," she said. "I didn't want to tell you something that might not hold." A pause. "I've been waiting to tell you something that would hold." He understood that. He'd been waiting for the same thing. "Merritt," he said. "The charges will be filed within 30 days according to the AG's office," she said. "Wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, potential violations of state banking law." A pause. "His attorneys will fight it. They will fight it for years, probably. But he is no longer operating. The development project is dead. No bank is going to finance a project tied to a criminal defendant in this environment. Halcyon Property Group's board has already requested his resignation." "Which he'll refuse," Brandon said. "Which he'll refuse," she agreed. "But it doesn't matter anymore. He's contained." Brandon thought about the pattern Victoria had described months ago. 6 years of careful work, one careful man engineering a scheme that had touched 47 families on a stretch of Pennsylvania road. He thought about the 94 days past, due that had landed in his email that April morning. He thought about the foreclosure notice arriving like clockwork, precise and bureaucratic and utterly indifferent to what it meant to receive it. He thought about how close it had come. 11 days, the first notice had said. 11 days. And if Victoria hadn't found him, if he'd never called that number on the attorney's letter, if she'd been the kind of person who expressed gratitude with a check and moved on, all of it would have continued. The machinery would have kept turning. "There's something else," Victoria said. "The Meridian investigation." He shifted on the equipment crate. "Go ahead." "The NTSB's formal findings come out next week. Not preliminary. Final. My attorneys were given a courtesy preview of the language." A pause. "It's definitive, Brandon. The failure was directly attributable to the stress fracture mechanism you documented. The counter-assessment is characterized as analytically insufficient, and there is specific language about the regulatory decision-making process and the handling of the original reports." "What kind of language?" "The kind that opens a formal review of the FAA's 2019 acceptance process," she said carefully. "The kind that names Meridian's engineering division in connection with the counter-assessment's deficiencies." He closed his eyes for a moment. The sunlight through the shed door was warm on his face. "Brandon," she said, "the Congressional Committee on Aviation Safety has opened an inquiry. They're going to want testimony, public testimony." A pause. "They're going to want yours." Congress. He sat with that for a moment. Public testimony. His name, his reports, his findings. On the public record, formally, in a way that could not be reclassified or buried or filed away as speculative. "When?" he said. "Not immediately. The committee is scheduling. probably fall. Okay, he said. Are you ready for that? For what it means? Your name connected to all of this publicly. I've been ready for 3 years, he said. I just didn't have the venue. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to ask you something. Okay? When this is over, the testimony, the formal proceedings, all of it, what do you want for yourself? The question surprised him, not because nobody had ever asked it, but because of when she was asking it, at the specific hinge point when after was becoming a real temporal concept rather than a theoretical one. I want to work on aircraft again, he said. Not maintenance, analysis, the real work. He paused. I want Lily to have a yard with a dogwood that she planted. She has that, Victoria said softly. I know. He paused. I want the next 3 years to be different from the last 3. They will be, she said. You don't know that. No, she said. I don't know it, but I believe it. A pause. Is that allowed? He thought about Clara's specific brand of belief, the kind that planted trees in the spring and expected to see them grow. He thought about Lily putting it in the bird story because she wanted it to be true, and the bird getting its crown anyway. Yeah, he said. That's allowed. The afternoon light sat warm on his face, and the runway was quiet outside. And somewhere across the state, a man named Douglas Merritt was looking at the shape of the consequences he'd accumulated and finding them considerably larger than he'd expected. And 63 aircraft had been inspected and cleared or grounded as the engineering required. And 47 families on Tanner Creek Road had one less thing to fear when they opened their mail. None of it was clean. None of it was finished. The legal process would grind on for months, probably years, and the families who'd lost properties might not get them back, and that was a real and permanent harm that no amount of justice made whole. The first officer in the cockpit of Flight 224. O was still gone, and would always be gone. Brandon knew all of that. He held all of that. But sitting in the maintenance shed with the June sun on his face, he let himself have the moment anyway. He'd earned the right to have it. He went back to work. 3 days later, Victoria drove to Mill Haven. She didn't announce it in advance. She texted him that morning, a single message, brief. Would it be all right if I came today? No agenda. He texted back, yes. She arrived at 4:30 in a car she drove herself, which for some reason he hadn't expected. She parked in front of the house and got out and stood in the late afternoon light of the Tanner Creek Road evening, in jeans and a gray jacket, and she looked at the house with its dogwood and its yard and its cracked porch railing he'd been meaning to fix. And he came out the front door and they stood there for a moment just being in the same physical space, which was different from phone calls in ways that neither of them had a precise language for yet. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. From inside the house, he heard Lily's feet on the hardwood floor, the small thunder of a 6-year-old who had heard an arrival. The screen door banged open, and Lily appeared on the porch in her school clothes, one sock on and one missing, and she looked at Victoria with the complete, frank assessment that children applied to new adults in their vicinity. You're Victoria, Lily said. Victoria looked at her. Yes, she said. You're Lily. Lily considered this confirmation for a moment. Do you want to see Marco? She said. Victoria looked at Brandon. The bird, he said. Yes, Victoria said, looking back at Lily. I would like to see Marco. Lily took her inside with the authority of a curator managing an important exhibit. Brandon followed. In the kitchen, Lily presented the bird on the windowsill with both hands, a gesture that was half offering and half proof. Marco stood in the afternoon light, lopsided and crowned and mismatched-eyed, with the accumulated dignity of a creature that had been given a story. Victoria looked at it for a long time. He's very good, she said. He has a story, Lily said. He goes away and comes back with something good. That's the whole story. What does he come back with? Victoria asked. Lily thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. Different things, she said. Depending. Victoria nodded slowly, like this was a complete and satisfying answer. That makes sense, she said.
Lily looked at her with the reassessment of someone whose expectations had been quietly exceeded. "Do you want to help me add to it?" she said. "The story." Brandon looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Lily. Something moved through her expression that was unguarded in a way he hadn't seen before. Not the contained precision of the conference room, not the careful warmth of the phone calls. Just something real and slightly undone by a 6-year-old with one sock and a paper bird. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." They sat down at the kitchen table, the three of them, in the late afternoon light of a June day in Millhaven, Pennsylvania. Outside, the dogwood moved in the warm wind. Down the road, Ray Castillo's truck was in the driveway, and Mr. Vreeland's porch light would come on when the evening came, the way it always did. The bird on the windowsill held its story. The story wasn't finished. Victoria stayed for 3 hours that first evening. There was no agenda, as she'd said. No legal update, no call with Elena Park, no documents requiring review. Just the three of them at the kitchen table with Lily's construction paper and the ongoing architecture of Marco's story, which expanded considerably under collaborative conditions. Victoria turned out to have specific and unexpected opinions about what a bird who traveled should encounter. She suggested a mountain, which Lily accepted after brief deliberation, and a river, which Lily modified to a creek because creeks were more interesting, and Brandon sat across from both of them and contributed when asked and mostly just watched. He watched Victoria with his daughter in the specific way you watch someone when you were trying to understand something about them that phone calls couldn't tell you. She didn't perform for Lily. She didn't do the thing adults sometimes did, the exaggerated enthusiasm, the talking down to, the performance of finding children charming. She just talked to her. Directly, with genuine attention, like Lily's thoughts about Marco's journey were worth taking seriously, which they were. Lily noticed. Lily always noticed. By the second hour, she was sitting close enough to Victoria that their arms were nearly touching, which was Lily's highest form of approval. Brandon made dinner. Pasta again, and this time he didn't burn it, and they ate at the kitchen table with Marco watching from the windowsill, and Lily told Victoria about school with the same prosecutorial thoroughness she applied to Brandon's daily debriefs. And Victoria listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, the kind that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. When Victoria left, Lily stood at the door and said, "You can come back." It was solemn, official, the full weight of a 6-year-old's endorsement. Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Brandon, briefly, just a glance, but the kind that contained something they hadn't yet put into words. "Thank you, Lily," she said. She drove away in the June evening, and Lily watched the car until it turned off Tanner Creek Road, and then she went inside and announced that it was time for her bath with the complete subject change velocity of childhood, and Brandon stood in the doorway a moment longer looking at the empty road. He went inside and ran her bath, and thought about the look. July arrived with the particular humidity that Pennsylvania summers inflicted without apology, and with it, the formal publication of the NTSB final report on Flight 240. Brandon read it alone, on a Saturday morning, while Lily was at a birthday party for a classmate. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, and he read it with the attention of someone who had written the source material, because in a real sense he had, 7 years ago, in 8 reports that nobody had wanted to read. The findings were 43 pages. He read every page. The metallurgical analysis was exact. The failure mode was exact. The language describing the origin of the fatigue fracture, thermal cycling stress in the aluminum alloy pylon attachment component under high-frequency, short-route operational conditions, was a technical confirmation of what he had documented in 2019 so precise that reading it felt, in a way he hadn't expected, like hearing his own voice played back to him after years of being told he hadn't spoken. The section on the regulatory history was careful, but clear. The 2019 FAA acceptance of Meridian Aerospace's counterassessment was characterized as having relied on an analytical framework that did not adequately account for the operational parameters documented in the original engineering reports. The counterassessment's author, a Meridian senior engineer named Robert Cathcart, was not named in the final report, but his firm's assessment was named, and the language around its deficiencies was not ambiguous.
The report included a recommendation for a full congressional review of the regulatory acceptance process for manufacturer-submitted counter-assessments. It cited, by reference number, all 8 of Brandon's original reports, by reference number, in a federal crash investigation's final published findings. He sat there for a long time after finishing. He thought about the morning he'd filed the first report, the specific fluorescent-lit conference room at Meridian where he'd handed the printed copy to his supervisor, a man named Dale Foss, who had looked at it with the professional blankness of someone who already knew how this would go. Brandon had been 30 years old. Lily hadn't been born yet. Clara had been alive and working and making plans. He thought about the last report, the 8th one, filed 14 months after the first, with less hope and more precision because he'd understood by then that his audience wasn't really the people in the room, but the record itself. The document that would exist regardless of whether anyone chose to act on it. He'd filed it knowing it would be reclassified. He'd filed it anyway. He'd never imagined it would end up cited in the document he was reading now. He picked up his phone. He called Victoria. "I read it," he said. "I know," she said. "I read it this morning, too." A pause. "The counter-assessment language. How does it feel, seeing it in print?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Like something that's been locked in a room for a long time finally got a door," he said. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes sense," she said quietly. "I keep thinking about Dale Foss," he said, "my supervisor at Meridian, the first person I handed a report to." He paused. "He's probably retired by now. I don't know if he ever thinks about it, whether he knew, really knew, what they were doing by dismissing it." "Some people know," Victoria said. "Some people just choose the easier conclusion." "That's almost worse," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked out the kitchen window. The July morning was bright and thick, the dogwood in full deep summer green, the yard the specific saturated color of a season at its peak. "The congressional testimony," he said. "The scheduling came through yesterday, September 9th. "I know," Elena confirmed it. A pause. "How are you feeling about it?" "Ready," he said. And then, more honestly, "Nervous, but ready." "Good," she said. "Nervous means you understand what it is. Ready means you'll do it anyway." A brief pause. "That's been your pattern throughout all of this." He didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Are you coming?" Silence. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But he'd learned to read her silences. "If you want me to," she said. "I'm asking," he said. "Then yes," she said. "I'll be there." Intent. She came to Millhaven 4 more times in July and August. The first time she brought work. She was still managing the bank transition, the audit follow-up, 2 other unrelated business matters that apparently didn't pause because she was driving to a small Pennsylvania town. She sat at Brandon's kitchen table with her laptop and her phone and moved through her afternoon with the contained efficiency that was simply how she operated, and Lily sat next to her doing homework with the comfortable proximity of a child who had decided a person was safe and acted accordingly. Brandon watched them from across the room and thought about the word safe. How it was the first thing you lost when things went badly and the last thing you thought you'd find again, and how sometimes it came back in shapes you hadn't thought to look for. The second time she came, it was raining. A real summer rain, the heavy Pennsylvania kind, and Lily was inside with her construction paper and her crayons and a project that had migrated from Marco's story to something she described only as the next thing, which Brandon understood meant it was too early for outside input. Victoria arrived wet from the car. She'd forgotten an umbrella, which was such a human ordinary thing that it took Brandon slightly by surprise, and stood in the kitchen doorway, dripping on the floor and looking at the rain through the window like she'd forgotten what it felt like to just be stuck inside somewhere. He handed her a dish towel. She looked at it, looked at him. There was a moment, the kind that existed between people who had been talking for months and were standing 3 feet apart for only the 4th time, and then she took the dish towel and dried her face and said, "I forgot what it's like to not have a schedule." "What does it feel like?" he said. She thought about it. "Strange," she said, and then not strange. They spent the afternoon doing nothing in particular. Lily showed Victoria the next thing, which turned out to involve a new character, a second bird, smaller, whose name was Ruth. Lily had opinions about Ruth's personality that she conveyed at length. Victoria contributed to the discussion with an engaged specificity that never felt performed. Brandon made dinner and they ate while the rain kept on, and afterward they sat on the back porch in the damp summer air and watched the yard, and the conversation moved the way it had started moving. Not linearly, not through topics arranged in order of importance, but associatively, the way conversations went between people who had covered the practical ground and were now in the territory underneath it. She told him about her company, not the business facts he already knew, the acquisitions, the portfolio, the strategic framework, but the real version. The year she'd almost lost it, when she was 25 and had overextended into a market that moved wrong, and the 4 months of that year she'd spent in a specific state of terror she'd told almost no one about. The relationship she'd ended at 27 because the man in it had wanted her to be less than she was, and she'd almost let him, and she still wasn't entirely sure what had stopped her. Fear, she said, of becoming a smaller version of myself, which is not the same as courage. I want to be honest about that. Fear and courage aren't mutually exclusive, he said. No, she said, but they're not the same thing. What's the difference? She thought about it, watching the rain drip from the porch roof. Courage is when you do something despite the fear because it matters more than the fear, she said. Fear by itself is just survival instinct. It doesn't make you good. It just makes you intact. And you'd rather be good than intact, he said. She looked at him. Wouldn't you? He thought about April 14th, about the sound of the aircraft failing, about the specific moment when he'd started running before he'd decided to run. I don't know if it's a choice, he said. For me, I don't know if I consciously decided anything. I just moved. That's not an argument against what I said, she said. That's what it looks like when it's already in you, when you've already decided at some level you don't have full access to. He looked at the rainy yard, the dogwood, soaked and dark, its leaves weighted down with water. Clara used to say something like that, he said. Not as a comparison between Victoria and Clara. He was aware enough of his own psychology to know the difference, but because it was true, and true things were worth saying. Victoria didn't react the way some people reacted when he mentioned Clara, with a slight flinch, a careful redirection, the social anxiety around grief that made people treat it like something contagious. She just nodded. What did she say? She asked. She said, most of the decisions that matter are made before you make them, he said. That what you think of as deciding is usually just catching up to yourself. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she was perceptive. She was, he said. She was a lot of things. The rain fell. The yard held its soaked green stillness. I would have liked to know her, Victoria said. Yeah, he said. She would have had opinions about you. Good opinions or bad? He thought about it honestly. Both, he said. Specific ones. She had specific opinions about everyone. It was one of her best qualities. Victoria looked at him. Something in her expression. He'd gotten better at reading it over the months, the particular texture of her face when she was feeling something she hadn't prepared a response for. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a while, she said. That a woman who sounds like she was remarkable would have had specific opinions about me. It is nice, he agreed. They sat in the warm, damp evening and listened to the rain, and it was comfortable in the way that two people were comfortable together when they had stopped performing and started just being present in the same place, which was its own kind of thing, and not a small one. September 9th came on a Tuesday. Brandon wore a suit he hadn't worn since Clara's funeral, which fit him differently than it had then. He was thinner through the shoulders in a way that 3 years of physical work had changed, and he'd had to have the jacket taken in slightly at a dry cleaner who did alterations. He didn't register the symbolism until he was standing in front of the mirror that morning, and then he stood there with it for a moment and decided it was all right. Things changed shape. That was what things did. Victoria drove him to Washington. She'd offered, and he'd said yes, which had required him getting Lily to Clara's parents, who had come up from Florida for the week. Margaret and Dave, who were good people dealing with their own ongoing grief, and who loved Lily with the uncomplicated fierceness of grandparents, and who had looked at Victoria, when they were introduced, with the precise attention of people taking careful measure. Margaret had pulled him aside before they left. She was a small woman with Clara's eyes, which never stopped being a particular kind of difficult. "She's good?" Margaret said. "Not is she nice, or do you like her? Just, she's good." "Yes," Brandon said. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, and that was all, and it was enough. The drive to Washington took 3.5 hours. They talked and didn't talk, and Brandon looked at the landscape moving past the window, Pennsylvania to Maryland to Virginia, the topography changing, and thought about the 8 reports and the counter-assessment and the April morning and all the distance between those things and the hearing room he was going to sit in today. "Are you ready?" Victoria said, somewhere in Maryland. "Ask me after," he said. "Fair," she said. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his forearm, just a moment, just a second's contact, and then put it back on the wheel. It was a simple thing. It was not a simple thing. He looked at the road ahead. The congressional hearing room was what it was. Wood paneling and institutional lighting and the elevated dais where the committee members sat in a long row, and the witness table where Brandon sat with his prepared statement and his 8 years of accumulated documentation. There were people in the gallery. There were cameras. There were reporters with the specific, focused energy of people who had done their research and were here for confirmation of what they already suspected. Victoria sat in the gallery, 3 rows back. He found her face before he sat down, and she gave him the smallest possible nod, barely perceptible, just a fraction, and he sat down. The committee chair was a senator from Ohio named Patricia Wynne, who had a reputation for not tolerating theater in her hearings, and who asked her questions in a direct, sequential manner that he appreciated. She opened by entering his documentation into the formal record. All 8 reports, the counter-assessment, his rebuttal, the FAA correspondence chain, and doing so with a gravity that made clear she understood what entering those documents meant. He read his prepared statement. 7 minutes. He'd written it 6 times, and the final version said exactly what it needed to say without ornament, what he had found, what he had reported, what had been done with those reports, what had subsequently occurred. When he finished, the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms were quiet when a thing had landed. Senator Wynne asked the first question. "Mr. Hale, when you filed your 8th and final internal report at Meridian Aerospace, did you believe it would result in any action?" He answered honestly. "No," he said. "I believed the process had already reached its conclusion. I filed it for the record." Why file it if you believed it would have no effect? He thought about how to say this simply. "Because the record is what's left after the people in the room have moved on," he said. "I wanted what I found to exist somewhere that couldn't be closed." Senator Wynne looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something down. The questions continued for 2 hours. Some were technical. Committee members who'd done their preparation asking about the specific failure modes, the metallurgical analysis, the operational parameters he'd identified. He answered those with precision and completeness because that was the language they were asking in, and it was the language he spoke most fluently. Some questions were about the regulatory process, how the counter-assessment had moved through the FAA system, who had signed what the procedural mechanisms for challenging an accepted counter-assessment were or weren't. He answered those too, and in answering laid out clearly and without dramatics a map of the gaps that had allowed a flawed analysis to substitute for a correct one. The final question came from a junior senator from Pennsylvania who had clearly read everything carefully and whose voice had something in it that wasn't political, but just human. "Mr. Hale," he said, "you tried for 14 months to prevent what happened on April 14th. You failed to prevent it. And then, on April 14th, you ran into the wreckage anyway. I want to ask you, and I understand this is a personal question, not a technical one. What do you do with that? How do you carry both of those things at the same time?" The room was quiet. Brandon looked at the senator. He thought about Lily's bird on the windowsill. He thought about the crescent moon nightlight and the glass of water on the nightstand. He thought about Clara's hands in the dirt and the dogwood in June and Victoria's hand on his forearm in Maryland. "You don't resolve it," he said. "You just carry it. The part that tried and failed and the part that ran toward the fire anyway. Those are the same person. I don't know how to separate them. I'm not sure I should try." He paused. "The only thing I know for certain is that filing those reports was right, and running into that aircraft was right. And if I was in the same situation tomorrow, I would do both things again. That's not heroism. That's just what you do when you see a problem you can fix and people who will be hurt if you don't try." The room held its silence. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," the senator said. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of consequence moved in multiple directions simultaneously, the way it always did when large things finally broke open. Douglas Merritt was indicted on 6 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, 2 counts of violating the Pennsylvania Banking Code, and 2 additional federal charges that emerged from the cooperation of Raymond Price, who had given the AG's office considerably more than anyone had publicly estimated. Merritt's attorneys filed motions. The motions were denied. Merritt's attorneys filed more motions. The process would take time. It always took time, but the direction was no longer ambiguous. Philip Garrett, Merritt's consultant, entered a plea agreement. The terms were not made public, but the practical effect was visible. Garrett became a cooperating witness, which meant the chain of documentation connecting Merritt's instructions to the bank's actions was no longer circumstantial. Raymond Price resigned from all positions and cooperated fully. He would receive reduced charges in exchange. Brandon had no strong feelings about Price's reduced charges. Price was the mechanism, not the architect. Mechanisms mattered less than architects. The bank's internal audit was completed and made available to regulators. The findings confirmed what Victoria's team had suspected, and then some: a coordinated 18-month program of targeted foreclosure executed against specific properties in the development corridor, with internal directives that tracked exactly to the communication chain Price had disclosed. 14 active foreclosure cases were immediately dismissed with prejudice. Of the 33 cases that had progressed further, 11 were reversed on fraud grounds after further legal action. Properties returned to their original owners, with legal fees covered by the bank in receivership. The remaining 22 cases involved properties that had transferred and changed hands in ways that made reversal legally complex. The civil judgment fund Victoria had established became the primary recourse for those families, and while money was not a house, it was not nothing. Ray Castillo got his house. Mr. Vreeland got his house. Brandon Hale got his house. He stood in the front yard on an October afternoon and looked at it. The same house he'd lived in for 3 years, the same cracked porch railing and the dogwood and the yard, and he let himself feel it fully. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more complicated, the specific feeling of having come through something rather than having won something, which were different experiences and didn't always feel the way you expected them to. He fixed the porch railing that weekend. Long overdue. Lily supervised from the porch steps, providing commentary on his technique that was specific and not entirely wrong. "You're doing it crooked," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm correcting it." "You should have measured first." "You're right," he said. "I should have." She accepted this with the grace of someone whose point had been acknowledged. "Victoria says you don't always measure," she said. He stopped working, looked at his daughter. "You talked to Victoria about this?" "She texted me," Lily said. "She texted you." "I can read texts," Lily said, with the specific dignity of a 7-year-old defending her capabilities. Her birthday had come in September, 7 now, which she applied to herself with a gravity befitting the number. "She sends me pictures sometimes, too, of places she goes." Brandon looked at his daughter on the porch steps. He thought about Victoria texting his daughter pictures of places she traveled. He thought about what that meant, the deliberateness of it, the sustained attention it represented, the choice to maintain a connection with a 7-year-old that nobody had required her to maintain. "Does she?" he said. "She sent one from San Francisco," Lily said. "The bridge." "What did you say?" Lily shrugged with the specific casualness of someone conveying important information indirectly. "I sent her a picture of Marco," she said. He looked at the porch railing, picked up the hammer. "That sounds about right," he said. The Meridian investigation moved on a parallel track through the fall and into winter. The FAA's internal review concluded that the 2019 acceptance of the counterassessment had involved procedural failures at two levels, the reviewing analyst and the supervisory sign-off, and recommended a restructuring of the counterassessment acceptance process that would require independent engineering verification for manufacturer-submitted analyses contesting safety reports. The recommendation was adopted. It would take 18 months to implement fully, and Brannon had no illusions about whether implementation would be perfect, because nothing was implemented perfectly. But the gap that had existed, the specific structural gap that had allowed his reports to be dismissed by the people with the most financial interest in dismissing them, would be narrowed, not closed. Narrowed. He'd take narrowed. Meridian Aerospace's engineering division came under formal investigation by the FAA and the Department of Transportation. Robert Cathcart, the author of the counterassessment, was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's conclusion. The investigation would determine what he knew and when, and whether what he'd produced represented negligence or deliberate misrepresentation. Brannon didn't know yet which it was. He suspected from the specific precision of the counterassessment's flaws that it was somewhere in the ugly middle, a man who knew his analysis was insufficient and chose the word speculative carefully enough to give himself deniability. He told Victoria this late one evening in November. They were on the phone, the way they still talked sometimes, even though she came to Millhaven most weekends now, and the phone was no longer the primary way they were in each other's lives. But old habits had their own weight. "What happens to someone like that?" she said. "Depends on what the investigation finds," he said. "If they can prove he knew, really prove it, documented evidence that he understood the failure mode and wrote around it, then it's fraud. If it stays in the territory of negligence and professional failure," he paused. "Then he loses his license probably, his career, the specific credibility that makes a career like that work. Is that enough?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "It's not enough for the first officer's family. Nothing is enough for that." He paused. "But it's something. It changes the cost calculation for the next person who's in that room, writing the next analysis." "You believe that," she said, "that it changes things? That making one example actually matters?" "I believe it moves the needle," he said. "Not all the way. Maybe not even most of the way. But in the direction." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a more modest belief than I expected from you." "I'm a modest person," he said. She laughed, the real one, the brief, surprised one. "Brandon, you ran into a burning aircraft." "That wasn't immodesty," he said. "That was geometry. The distance between me and the people inside was short." "You're very stubborn about refusing to be remarkable," she said. "It's not stubbornness," he said. "I just know what I am." "And what's that?" He thought about it. "Not in the way you thought about something you'd never considered, but in the way you thought about something you'd turned over many times and finally had a word for." "Someone who keeps going," he said. "That's the main thing. Someone who files the 8th report even when the first 7 did nothing. Someone who runs toward the sound. Someone who—" He stopped, started again. "Someone who stays present for his kid even when the staying is hard. That's what I am. It's not remarkable. There are a lot of people like that." "There are," she said. "But not enough." The November evening was dark outside his kitchen window. The dogwood had dropped its leaves again. The full cycle completed, bare branches against the dark sky, patient and specific. "Victoria," he said. "Yes." "I want to ask you something." He heard her shift, heard the quality of attention change. "Okay," she said. "When this is all finished, the formal processes, the investigations, all of it wound down, what do you want? For yourself?" He paused. "You asked me that back in June. I answered. I don't think you did." Silence. A longer one this time. "I don't answer that question easily," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Answer it anyway." Another pause. He let it be. I want to stop being afraid that things will disappear, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its professional precision. I've been running forward at full speed for 6 years because stopping felt like if I stopped, I'd see how much I'd lost when my father died, and I'd have to feel it properly. And I didn't want to feel it properly. A pause. I've been slowing down lately. Being in Millhaven makes me slow down. Lily makes me slow down. Another pause. You make me slow down. He held the phone and looked out the window at the bare dogwood. Is that okay? She said. Her voice had the specific, careful quality of someone saying something that mattered, while remaining ready for it not to be received the way they hoped. Yes, he said, without hesitation. The way you said things when they were simply true. He heard her exhale. Good, she said, because I intend to continue. Spring came again. The way it always came, reluctantly at first, the frost still stubborn in the mornings, and then all at once, the season committing. The dogwood budded in March and flowered in April. White blossoms, the same as every year, the tree doing what it had been planted to do. Lily noticed them on a Wednesday morning from the kitchen window. She was 7 now, and her observations about the world had acquired additional precision without losing their essential directness. And she said, "It does that every year." "It does," Brandon said. "Does it know it's the same tree?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Like, does it remember last year? Does it know that it already did this?" He thought about it seriously because it was a serious question, even if it sounded like it wasn't. "I don't think so," he said. "Not the way we remember, but it does it anyway. It doesn't need to remember to do it." Lily considered this. "Marco remembers," she said. Marco was on the windowsill, relocated there, so permanently now that he had effectively become furniture. His crown had been augmented twice more, and he had acquired a small paper companion in Ruth. And the story Lily had built around them had grown long enough that she'd started writing it down in a notebook, in the careful handwriting of a second grader taking something seriously. "Marco does remember," Brandon agreed. "Victoria's coming Saturday," Lily said, with the tone of someone reporting a scheduled item. "I know," he said. "She said she was bringing coffee from the place she likes in Philadelphia." Lily looked at him over her cereal bowl with the specific expression she deployed when she had a thought she was deciding whether to say. Then she said it. "Are you going to marry her?" Brandon looked at his daughter. "Where did that come from?" he said. Lily shrugged, the portrait of innocence. "Denise next door said you two were probably going to get married," she said. "And I think she might be right." "Denise Castillo." "She talks to me sometimes when I'm getting the mail," Lily said. "She says you both have the look." "What look?" Lily thought about it. "Like you know where the other person is even when you're not looking," she said. He sat with that for a moment. 7 years old. The specific perception of a child who had been paying close attention to the adults in her life and had developed considerable diagnostic capability as a result. "We're figuring things out," he said carefully. Lily looked at him with the patience of someone waiting for the actual answer. "I care about her," he said. "A lot." "I know," Lily said. "I care about her too." She picked up her spoon. "You should tell her that. More." "I tell her," he said. "Dads are bad at that," she said with the authority of someone who had done extensive comparative research. He thought about arguing. He didn't. "Okay," he said. "I'll tell her more." Lily nodded with the satisfaction of an advisor whose recommendation has been accepted. "Good," she said. "Can I have more cereal?" Saturday was warm and clear, the kind of April day that Pennsylvania gave you occasionally, as if apologizing for everything else. Victoria arrived at 10 in the morning with coffee from the Philadelphia place and a small paper bag of pastries that Lily assessed with immediate expertise before approving them. The three of them sat on the back porch for most of the morning. Victoria and Lily were deep in the latest evolution of Marco's story, which had taken a turn that Lily described as the complicated part. Brandon was on his end of the porch with his coffee, listening without interjecting, watching the yard. The dogwood was in full bloom. The yard had the deep green of a spring that had finally arrived and was staying. Down the road, he could hear Ray Castillo's boys playing in the yard. They were loud kids, the kind of loud that was just life happening enthusiastically. And further, the sound of Mr. Vreeland's lawnmower, which the old man operated at a pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry to finish. The ordinary sounds of a street where people lived. Victoria was telling Lily something about a mountain she'd seen in Colorado, relating it to Marco's mountain in the story. And Lily was asking questions with the focused intensity she applied to new information, and Brandon watched them both and thought about the past year. He thought about the shape of it, the crash and the fire, and the foreclosure notice, and the calls, and the hearing room in Washington, and the legal process grinding forward, and the families on Tanner Creek Road keeping their houses. And he thought about the way the year had refused to be a clean story. It had been a year of things he'd done that were right, and things he'd failed to prevent, and things that were neither his success nor his failure, but just what happened when large systems came into contact with individual people who refused to behave like components. He thought about the first officer in the cockpit of Flight 2240. He thought about that often. There was no resolution to that thinking, no place it could arrive that felt complete. The man had a name, Kevin Marsh, the investigation had published it, and a family, and he had been in a seat that was unsurvivable, and none of the subsequent accountability changed that fundamental, irreversible fact. Brandon had learned to hold it without trying to resolve it. That was the most honest thing you could do with certain kinds of grief. Hold it without requiring it to mean something, or lead somewhere, or teach a lesson that justified the cost. What he knew, sitting on the back porch in the April morning, was this. You didn't do the right thing because it guaranteed good outcomes. You did it because it was the right thing, and you filed the reports even when they disappeared into the institution's indifference, and you ran toward the sound even when you didn't know what you'd find. And you told the truth in the hearing room even when the truth was complicated and the room was watching and the cameras were on. Not because any of it would definitely work. Because you were the kind of person who did those things. And that was not a choice you made in the moment, but something you'd already settled long before the moment arrived. That was the thing he'd tried to tell the senator, and he wasn't sure he'd said it well, but he'd said it honestly. Victoria was laughing at something Lily had said, the real laugh. The one he'd come to understand was the truest version of her, the one that still seemed slightly surprised at itself, as if she kept forgetting she was allowed to have it. Lily was grinning with the complete confidence of someone who knew exactly how funny she'd been. Brandon looked at the dogwood. The blossoms were fully open, white and unambiguous, the tree doing its thing without knowing it was doing its thing, without needing the context of previous springs to make this one real. He got up and walked to the end of the porch where Victoria was sitting. She looked up at him. Lily was already moving on to the next part of the story, narrating to herself, absorbed. He sat down next to Victoria, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. The Castillo boys are loud today, she said. They're always loud, he said. She smiled, looked out at the yard. I've been thinking about something, she said, since the board called yesterday. What did the board want? They want me in London for 3 weeks in June. There's a portfolio company that needs direct attention. She paused. Normally, I'd just go. Normally, he said. She looked at the dogwood for a moment. I was thinking about whether Lily has school through the end of June. It was offered carefully, almost sideways, in the way she offered things that mattered to her when she wasn't sure how they'd land. He was quiet for a moment. School ends June 14th, he said. London in summer is not bad, she said. There are good parks. I know which ones. He looked at her. She was looking at the yard with the specific expression she got when she'd said something important and was waiting for a response without appearing to wait. Lily's never been to London, he said. No, she said. Marco hasn't either, he said. Victoria turned her head and looked at him, and there was something in her face, open and careful and slightly lit from somewhere. And he thought about what Lily had said at breakfast, like you know where the other person is even when you're not looking. He took her hand. Simple. His hand around hers, on the arm of the porch chair, in the April morning. She didn't say anything. She turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that while Lily continued narrating Marco's story to herself. Something about a mountain and a creek and a bird who went far and always came back. And the dogwood bloomed in the yard that Clara had planted it in, and the Castillo boys were loud next door, and Mr. Vreeland's lawnmower moved at its unhurried pace, and the street held its ordinary life around them. "We could take him," Lily said suddenly. She was standing at the screen door with Marco in both hands, having apparently decided the story required real-world research. "Marco, we could take him to London." Victoria looked at Brandon. Brandon looked at his daughter, with her paper bird, its crown, and its mismatched eyes, and the accumulated weight of a story that had been going since April, since the beginning of all of it, since a morning when everything broke in two directions at once. "Yeah," he said. "We could do that." Lily stepped back inside with Marco, satisfied, already planning the next part. The screen door swung shut behind her. The spring morning continued. Brandon held Victoria's hand and looked at the yard, at the tree his wife had planted and the new season it was in, at the street where people stayed because someone had decided they deserved to, at the ordinary, irreducible fact of a day that had no crisis in it, no emergency, nothing required of him except to be there. He was there. That was enough. That was, after everything, exactly enough.